Whispers of Runeterra.
Welcome, Summoner. You already know their names. You have heard them whispered in Champion Select, seen them stride through cinematic fog with orchestral thunder beneath their feet, felt the faint echo of their tragedies in a line of voice work that plays while you alt-tab. In a world as wide as Runeterra, these are the tragedies the game itself places in your hands, polished, simplified, ready to be locked in. Viego is perhaps the clearest marble figure, the ruined king, whose love for Isolde was so absolute that when death took her, he shattered a kingdom to pull her spirit back. You see him in trailers cradling her lifeless body, black mist coiling like grief made visible, his blade a thin argument against the finality of the grave. His in-game lines speak of her, always her, turning an apocalypse into something that feels almost like a love poem written with the ink of war. Lucian and Senna arrive as a pair of hunters, twin pistols burning in the dark. On the loading screen, he is the righteous marksman, she the returned soul, both framed against the sickly glow of Thresh's lantern. The story the client tells you is simple. A husband, a stolen wife, a warden of the damned who must be destroyed so her spirit may finally rest. Every time Lucian reloads, every time Senna's gun roars, you are invited to hear only justice in the report. Then there is Aatrox, the darkened sword. On splash art, he towers above a broken battlefield, wings spread, blade raised, the very image of war given form and fury. You are told he was once an ascended hero, now corrupted. His voice lines thunder about annihilation, conquest, the joy of battle. The horror here is quiet, buried under the fantasy of playing as a living catastrophe, as if the only truth in him were the swing of his weapon. Pantheon, too, arrives as a clean myth. A fallen aspect, Atreus bearing the name of a god that died inside his own body, now a mortal man who still throws himself against titans with a spear and a shield. The game gives you the image of a warrior who refused to break, who became the very constellation he once served. His ult draws a burning line across the land, and you are meant to read it as courage made visible. You think you know this story, do you not? Callista, the spear of vengeance, rising from black mist to answer betrayal with perfect spectral aim. Thresh, the cackling jailer, an entire shadow isles of wronged souls and the monsters who bind them. These are presented as legends with sharp edges, with heroes and villains cleanly divided, with motives you can summarize in a single word: revenge, justice, conquest, duty. Allow the night to grow a little deeper. Let the details move past you like drifting ash, and you may sense what is missing. The hesitation before Viego's first forbidden ritual, the moment Lucian chose the blade over forgiveness, the instant Aatrox realized he could no longer remember his own face, the quiet terror in Atreus when the god inside him screamed and went silent. The game hands you the splash art. Beneath it lie smaller, more painful truths, born not from grandeur, but from weakness. It is into those hidden chambers that we must now descend. Beneath the splash art, the promise of the stories. You weren't shown. We have stepped through the door of the grand moments. Now allow the night to grow a little deeper. If the splash art is the painting on the temple wall, what waits for you now is the narrow stairway behind it, where the air is close and the dust remembers every footstep that ever fled. You think you know this story, do you not? You know the king on his ruined throne, the angel with burning wings, the swordsman whose skin is a prison for a fallen god. Yet beneath every official biography there lies a second story, quieter and far more cruel. A childhood that never learned how to say no. A a small fear that no one took seriously, a single compromise made in the dark and never spoken of again. The horror here is quiet, like a blade sliding back into its sheath after it has already done its work. In a world as wide as Runeterra, a champion is never only an individual. They are products of their land, of kingdoms that demanded perfection and called it virtue, of wars that chewed through soldiers and named the remains glory, of magic that offered miracles with prices written in invisible ink. Demacia does not simply produce kale, it forges a girl in a furnace of expectation until mercy sounds like treason. Noxus does not simply recruit Swain, it rewards the man who can look at a field of corpses and see only potential. Let the details move past you like drifting ash. Etrox was once carved into murals as a saviour of Shurima, an ascended hero whose very presence promised victory. Now he hijacks mortal bodies just to feel himself die. His voice lines a litany of exhaustion rather than rage. Atreus once believed the stars had chosen him. Then he felt a god die screaming inside his ribs, and woke to find he was only a man, asked to stand against titans with nothing but a mortal spine. These are not instant catastrophes. They are slow, sad erosions. Marriages strain under duty long before lanterns steal souls. Lucian and Senna spend years learning to live with the fact that their love must always make room for the war against the Shadow Isles. Friendships erode under ideology. Brothers in Demacia patrol side by side until the mage hunts demand that one turn in the other. Bodies and minds are altered by powers they never fully consented to. Callista is murdered by the king she swore to protect and rises as vengeance incarnate. Hecarim rides forever at the head of a charge that never ends. Viego's grief spills outward until an entire civilization drowns in it. By the time you meet them on the rift, the damage is done. What you see is armour, sorcery, divinity. What you do not see is the years of small human surrenders that made the tragedy inevitable. Stay with these stories, and by the end you will not simply know which champions are tragic, you will understand why their tragedies feel disturbingly human, even when they wear the armour of gods. Because next, we will walk into one of these lives and watch the first, almost invisible crack appear. How we'll walk this graveyard, a guided journey through ruined lives. So we will not rush this. We will descend. In a world as wide as Runeterra, you cannot understand a single ruined champion without first feeling the air of the crypt that birthed them, the weight of the land that watched them fall. Think of this as walking deeper into a catacomb, broad halls first, then narrow chambers where only one name fits on the wall, before you climb back toward the night changed by what you have seen. We begin with the world itself, with regions that pretend to be separate yet share the same graveyard of ideals. Demacia, bright as polished steel, where light becomes a prison for mages and loyalty sharpens into a blade turned inward. Noxus, brutal and pragmatic, where war is a ledger and soldiers are ink. Ionia, forever trying to balance spirit and flesh, haunted each time the wind moves through trees that remember invasion. The Shadow Isles, where mourning never ends. The Void, which is not a place so much as an absence that chews at meaning. You will walk through each, not as a tourist, but as a witness. Then we narrow the lantern's beam. We will stand beside noble figures as they realise their heroism has curdled. Atrox, once a revered ascended, now hijacking mortal bodies simply to feel himself die again. Pantheon's Atreus, a man who housed a god, survived its death and must still lift his spear against titans, knowing he is only human. You think you know this story, do you not? That heroes fall because of one grand sin. The horror here is quiet, like a blade sliding back into its sheath after it has already done its work. From there, love rots. We will watch Viego's grief over Isolde ferment into the ruination, a single heart cracking an entire kingdom. We will walk with Lucian, whose every shot is aimed at the warden who cages his wife's spirit in a lantern, and with Senna, who must live with the knowledge that her freedom was paid for in uncounted other souls. Let the details move past you like drifting ash. Remember only the taste of obsession, of devotion turned into a curse. Deeper still, we come to soldiers broken by duty. Callista, betrayed and murdered by the king she swore to protect, bound into undeath as a vengeance given form. Hecarim, once a knight, now a cavalry charge that never ends. Around them Demetria's mage hunters, Noxian generals, Ionian resistance fighters, all the brothers and sisters of war who discovered their banners demanded more than their lives. They demanded their humanity. And beneath even that, the floor gives way to cosmic hunger, darkened blades that wear men like gloves, gods that abandon their hosts when belief falters, fiddlesticks, a scarecrow that is only the mask fear wears, the void swallowing names until only hunger speaks. Here the question is no longer what choice they made, but whether they were ever allowed a choice at all. Allow the night to grow a little deeper. You do not need to memorize every title, every date, every ruined empire. You are not here to pass a test. You are here to follow a single through line of feeling as each story leans on the last. Heroism to obsession, duty to ruin, identity to erasure. By the time we return to the surface, you will not remember every name on the stone, but you will know why the whole graveyard feels like one long, unfinished prayer. Next, we step through the first archway and let one life close around us. How to listen to horror. That whispers your single thread. Through the dark. Next, we step through the first archway and let one life close around us. But before we do, you need a lantern, not of light, but of feeling. In a world as wide as Runeterra, details breed like shadows. If you chase each one, you will lose the path. So we will walk with a single thread wrapped around your wrist, and every story you hear will tug on it in the same relentless way. That thread begins in love. Love between brothers, between king and queen, between a soldier and the land he swore to defend. Then watch how that love becomes betrayal, sometimes in a single heartbeat, sometimes over years of small compromises. Betrayal becomes suffering, as with Lucian and Senna hunting the lantern that cages her spirit, or Callista feeling the blade of the king she died to protect. Suffering hardens into a lie. I deserved this. There was no other choice. War made me this. And somewhere far later than it should, there is the moment that lie finally breaks. So as we move through these ruins of lives, let the details move past you like drifting ash. The exact battle where Atreus watched Pantheon die in his own chest, the obscure name of the Demacian decree that turned mages into quarry, the forgotten general who first marched beside Swain's ravens, you may let them go. The horror here is quiet, like a blade sliding back into its sheath after it has already done its work. What matters is that you feel the pattern repeating in different armour, in different accents, in different prayers. This is Runeterra after dark. Not the bright, balanced arena where you lock in champions, but the echo that remains when the match is over and no one logs back on. Here, Kayla is not a righteous pick. She is a sister whose justice burned until it could no longer recognise Morgana's face. Here, Aatrox is not a damage dealer. He is an ancient hero who hijacks mortal bodies just to feel himself die. You think you know this story, do you not? You have seen their splash art, heard their voice lines, but those are the masks they wear for the day. As we speak, we will move like the wind itself, close, then far, whisper, then gale. We will lean in on a single decision, The moment Viego chooses resurrection over mourning, the instant Hecarim spurs his charge instead of calling retreat, and then we will pull back until you see the war machine, the empire, or the cosmic hunger that made that decision feel inevitable. Intimacy, then scale. A trembling hand, then the army that drove it. Allow the night to grow a little deeper, because to understand why these champions are tragic, we must first understand the world that made tragedy their only possible ending. A land where honour can be a noose, where love can be a weapon, where even gods like the Darkin are puppeted by older horrors. Next, we widen our gaze and let Runeterra itself step forward. The empires, the void, the spirits, and the quiet rules of a universe that grinds its heroes down to ghosts. A world written in scars, why no tragedy in Runeterra, stands alone. So let us do that. Allow the night to grow a little deeper and step back from faces and names until the map itself comes into view, not as parchment and ink, but as a body lying under the moon. In a world as wide as Runeterra, the land is not neutral. It is a patient witness, a wounded witness, and every champion you know walks across old injuries that were bleeding long before they were born. Imagine rivers first. They run like veins, carrying memory as much as water, threading through deserts, tundras, and cities that pretend to be new. The mountains rise like bones, hard and indifferent, yet carved by centuries of war into ramparts and tombs. Borders do not appear by accident. They are scars, the jagged lines of surgeries performed by empires that have already died, cut and recut until the flesh of the world no longer remembers how it felt to be whole. Look to Shurima, where an empire once rose like a golden heartbeat in the centre of the continent. Its ascended heroes were meant to be antibodies against chaos, radiant guardians etched into murals and hymns. Now one of them, Atrox, staggers through eras, hijacking mortal bodies with a blade that howls for extinction, not glory. The horror here is quiet, like a god who can no longer remember why he was worshipped, only that he wants it all to end. Turn your gaze to the ruined isles, once the blessed isles, a kind of brain of the world's magic, delicate and luminous. Viego's grief, one king's private wound, ruptured that organ in a single catastrophic decision, and the ruination spilled out like blackened blood. Thresh, Callista, Hecarim, Karthus, each personal tragedy is anchored in that one necrotic stroke, souls trapped in undeath because an ancient system had no gentle way to process loss. Far north, the Freljord shivers in a permanent civil war, ribs of ice cracked by feuding sisters and forgotten pacts. Every tribal oath, every broken alliance is another fracture in the world's sternum, so that even a single warrior's fall is only an echo in a blizzard of older betrayals. To the east, Ionia still twitches from old surgery, its spiritual nerves half severed by the Noxian invasion. You can walk through its bamboo and hear the wind move like a phantom limb, remembering blades that are no longer there. Damatia's marble spine is calcified fear, a ribcage built to keep magic out and, in doing so, crush the lungs of its own mages. Noxus is an endless appetite, a stomach that calls hunger glory and digests soldiers like Atreus until even gods die inside them. Piltover gleams like a jewelled skull, bright above, hollow beneath, while Zaun rots in the sinuses below, breathing out fumes that corrode those gilded ideals. And under all of it, the void waits, a tumour beneath the skin of reality, slow, patient, certain. You think you know this story, do you not? A single champion, a single fall, a single choice. But let the details move past you like drifting ash, and you will see the pattern. By the time our tragic figures draw breath, the body of Runeterra has already decided what kind of pain it will feed them. No one falls alone. They are pulled down by arteries of old war, by bones of empire, by scars that will demand more blood before the night is done. Where the veil is thinnest, Ionia as a conversation between worlds. So let the camera sink now, down through the arteries of old war, until it finds the place where those scars are not buried but breathing. Ionia waits there, not as a backdrop, as a presence, as a land that listens when you speak and remembers when you would rather forget. Ionia is not just soil and stone, it is a conversation carried on in whispers between root and river, shrine and shadow, mortal breath, and the spirit that leans close to hear it. Every footstep is answered, every word is weighed. The horror here is quiet, like a blade sliding back into its sheath after it has already done its work, leaving only the echo of the cut in the dark behind your ribs. In a world as wide as Runeterra, most places separate the visible from the unseen with thick, merciful walls. Ionia does not. Here the boundary thins like worn silk. There are shrines where, if you kneel and ask a question, something answers from the other side with a voice that sounds almost like your own. There are forests that rearrange themselves between dusk and dawn, so a guilty man can never quite find the same path twice. There are rivers that do not only carry water, but also the taste of old grief, so that a single sip can bring back a memory you never lived. This is not vague mysticism. It has rules as sharp as steel. A blade stroke in a duel does not end when it draws blood. It drags a bright line through the spirit realm, carving a path that other presences can follow. A broken oath does not simply shame the tongue that spoke it. It seeps into the ground, staining a courtyard, a dojo, a village square, until even the wind moves differently there. A massacre is not just a number of dead, it is a wound in the local spirits, twisting them into something vengeful that will not rest while a single descendant still walks. Allow the night to grow a little deeper, and you can almost see them. A young soldier on patrol passing the blackened stumps of a copse his unit burned for tactical clarity, feels the branches he cut, watching him, every creak of bamboo a slow, disappointed breath. A village wakes from the same nightmare on the same night, each person having stood on the same cliff, heard the same child call their name, felt the same unseen hand push. There is a battlefield where the grass has grown back, where flowers open politely in the sun. And yet, when the wind runs across it, it never sounds like leaves. It sounds like screaming that never learned how to stop. You think you know this story, do you not? A war-torn nation, a pair of brothers, a single catastrophic choice. But in Ionia, tragedy is not permitted to end at the grave. Pain lingers as ghosts, as curses, as living myths that refuse to be forgotten. Aatrox's ruined ascended form may rampage far away. Viego's ruination may drown distant shores. Yet here, a single unjust death can be enough to bend a valley's spirit for generations. Every duel has an echo. Every broken promise has witnesses. Every corpse has neighbours that will not look away. When a boy like Yasuo draws his blade, when the wind itself seems to take a side, do you truly think only 2 lives are in the balance? Or has the land already chosen what it wants from them next? Stains that never dry, recasting tragedy as quiet, persistent horror. The land has already chosen, and it does not forget. You will in time. Faces blur, names slip. Even the sharpest grief dulls at the edges, but the soil does not share your mercy. Beneath your feet, the original script remains, written in root and rust and the thin, invisible scars where spirits once bled through. In a world as wide as Runeterra, human memory is a shallow river. It meanders, it dries. It can be redirected by a single victorious speech or a new monument. The horror here is quiet, like a blade sliding back into its sheath after it has already done its work. The land, by contrast, is a deep well. Ink sinks there and never fully disperses. A broken oath in Ionia becomes a shadow under a shrine stone. A massacre on the Shadow Isles becomes fog that will not lift. You think you know this story, do you not? Aatrox as a raging monster, Viego as a mad king, Thresh as a theatrical tormentor. Let the details move past you like drifting ash, and you miss the slower, more patient terror. Each of them is a stain that refused to dry. Aatrox was once carved into murals as a saviour, an ascended hero. Now his sword drinks not only blood, but the narrative itself, hijacking mortal bodies so that his despair can keep walking, keep killing, keep begging for an end that never comes. Violence in Runeterra is not an event. It is an amendment to reality. When Viego's grief cracked the Blessed Isles, it did not simply kill a kingdom. It rewrote the rules of death so thoroughly that Karthus's hymns became a geography, and Callista's betrayal by the king she swore to protect hardened into a law of vengeance that still hunts, promises broken in the present. On the Shadow Isles, every scream is precedent. Every execution is case law. Allow the night to grow a little deeper. Consider Ionia, where war once moved through bamboo like a fever. The Noxian invasion did not end when the last soldier fell back across the sea. It lingers as spirits that flinch at marching feet, as fields that will not grow where Hecarim's riders trampled villagers into the mud. Blood seeped into the roots, and the roots learned. Now, when blades rise again, the land remembers the pattern and calls demons that taste the same fear. These are not isolated curses, but habits of the world. Thresh's lantern does not only hold Senna's soul, it archives every terrified story it has ever stolen, so that Lucian is not merely fighting a warden, but an accumulated archive of suffering that has learned to enjoy itself. Rast does not just cut, it whispers, tracing old grooves of temptation in Cain's mind, the way water finds familiar channels in stone. Demons like fiddlesticks are not random apparitions, but the shape fear takes when repeated in the same key for centuries. So when you look at a champion's kit, the way Viego's mist spreads, the way Aatrox swells with each kill, the way Kindred marks a target, you are not just seeing design. You are seeing symptoms of a haunting, the visible grammar of rules the land has already accepted. The match will end. The client will close, but the stain remains and the spirits keep reading from it line by line until someone adds a darker sentence on top. When war comes to a sacred land, Noxus, Ionia, and manufactured tragedy. So when the stain darkens, it does not stay on parchment. It walks, it marches, it comes ashore in iron boots and measured formations. Allow the night to grow a little deeper and listen. Across the sea from Ionia's bamboo hills, Noxus inhales the scent of unclaimed power and exhales war. You can hear the difference before you see it. Ionia's mornings begin with temple bells and the soft percussion of wind in chimes. Noxus arrives with the cough of gunpowder, the grind of siege engines dragging scars through rice paddies and shrine gardens, wheels splintering prayer stones that have stood longer than any empire. The horror here is quiet, like a blade sliding back into its sheath after it has already done its work, because the soldiers who topple statues and trample spirit offerings do not even believe in the things they are killing. In a world as wide as Runeterra, there are many kinds of faith. Noxus believes in strength through any means, in victory as its own absolution. Ionia believes in balance and patience, in a land that remembers every oath. Place those creeds on the same field and you do not get compromise. You get an imbalance so profound that cruelty becomes almost administrative, a line item on a campaign ledger, while the spirits recoil and the soil drinks more blood than rain. War compresses the horizon of choice until it is only a blade's width. A village that once argued about harvest rituals now argues about whether to burn its own bridges to slow the advance or to leave them intact and pray the banners pass by. Some kneel to Noxian officers and offer maps, children, information. Others vanish into the forests with makeshift spears, becoming rebels in a story they never chose to enter. Elders sit in half-ruined halls, deciding which traditions must be broken so that at least someone survives to remember them. In that pressure, young warriors are handed impossible tasks and told they are duty. Irelia, still half a child, learns to turn her family's grave markers into dancing blades because there is no one else left to stand between her people and the next wave of red. Yasuo is ordered to hold a gate while the wind itself screams that his master is dying elsewhere, and you already know what one step away from that post will cost him. Let the details move past you like drifting ash. A student who wanted to perfect forms becomes a killer. A guardian who swore an oath finds that oath hardening into chains as his commanders barter lives for ground. Children are orphaned in a single afternoon and grow up speaking the language of vengeance more fluently than their own names. Brothers are set on opposite sides of an order's verdict. Teachers die and their lessons are rewritten by war into something sharper, crueler, less forgiving. Many of the champions you lock in began here, not as icons, but as survivors of a sacred land being measured in leagues and supply lines. And Noxus, for all its brutality, is only one mask that invasion wears. Demacia hunts its own mages in the name of purity. The Shadow Isles let ruination seep like poison tide. The Void does not march with drums at all. It simply arrives and unnames what it touches. This is the larger pattern. Empire, magic, nothingness. Each a different kind of storm. Each breaking people until the spirits have new tragedies to read and new champions to bind to their darkest sentences. Heroes rewritten as monsters. The fall of the Ascended and the birth of Darkin Empire, magic, nothingness, each a storm, you remember. But there is a fourth weather in Runeterra, and it is worse than all the rest. It is the stillness after the storm, when the heroes who survived are told they may never lay their blades down. In a world as wide as Shurima's Golden Age, the Empire did not trust mere men to hold its borders. It raised champions out of flesh and into legend. The Ascended were once mortal warriors and sages, lifted by the burning grace of the sun disk until their bones sang with celestial fire. Lion-headed gods were carved into temple walls, jackal-faced guardians watched from sandstone columns, and children traced their silhouettes in dust, certain that such saviours in radiant armour could never fall. The land believed in them. The spirits did too, but war is a patient sculptor. It chips at the soul in campaigns, in sieges, in the long marches where the wind only carries the names of the dead. The Ascended were sent again and again, against invading empires, against traitorous brothers within their own ranks, against the unspeakable hunger of the void that howled beneath the desert. Each victory cost a fragment of mercy. Each betrayal within Shurima's courts drove another crack through immortal minds already stretched thin. The horror here is quiet, like a blade sliding back into its sheath after it has already done its work. Allow the night to grow a little deeper, because the end of Shurima's glory was not an explosion, but a slow inversion. Some Ascended clung to purpose, others lost themselves to rage, to pride, to the intoxicating certainty that if they were gods, then war itself was their birthright. When the Empire finally fell, what remained were not guardians, but predators too powerful to kill, too broken to trust. So the world did the only mercifully cruel thing it could. It sealed them. You think you know this story, do you not? Mighty beings locked away, ancient weapons buried. Yet the curse of the Darken is not simply imprisonment. Their souls were bound into the instruments they once wielded, consciousness hammered into steel and stone. They could not die. They could not sleep. They waited as centuries turned to sand, until desperate mortals lifted those blades and spears and living prisons from forgotten tombs. To move again, the Darkin must hijack those bodies, wearing them like borrowed funerals, chasing the faint illusion of mortality that will always slip from their grasp. Aatrox is the clearest wound. Once he strode as a revered ascended general, a living standard on the battlefield, the kind of figure who made terrified soldiers stand firm simply by existing beside them. Now he is a walking apocalypse who speaks like a man drowning in eternity. Listen to his voice lines, and you do not hear theatrical bravado. You hear someone begging the universe to end him, promising slaughter not for conquest, but in the deranged hope that enough war might finally break his own curse. This is a different flavour of tragedy than a single fall from grace. It is not one bad choice, not one moment of weakness. It is being stretched on the rack of immortality until every virtue snaps, until duty curdles into hatred and heroism rots into predation. Let the details move past you like drifting ash. A lion god reduced to a parasite in a sword, a saviour who must possess the living to feel almost dead, an empire's brightest defenders turned into relics that must never be unearthed. And yet, of course, they are unearthed, because men still seek power, because war never truly ends, because somewhere another kind of champion will look at a cursed weapon, hear a whisper, and make a choice that binds them to a fate even darker than the Darkins, and that is where we must go next. Aatrox, the hero who can only live by dying. So let us follow one of those weapons as it is raised from the dust. Allow the night to grow a little deeper around us. Imagine not a cursed blade in a forgotten crypt, but a mural, sunlit and bright, where that same warrior was once painted with a laurel crown and wings of living light. You think you know this story, do you not? Aatrox is introduced to you in the game as a roaring engine of war, a blade that walks, a monster who laughs at slaughter. Yet, in a world as wide as Runeterra, even monsters have beginnings, and his began with duty. He was one of Shurima's ascended, a mortal who stepped willingly into the burning crucible of godhood, believing that if his flesh ended and his spirit was remade, his people might live. On temple walls he stood beside Nasus and Renekton, a brother in radiance, a saviour carved into stone. But immortality stretches. Centuries of war do not feel like legend when you are the one holding the blade. At first he fought invaders and horrors from the dark between stars. Then he fought neighbouring kingdoms, then rebels, then anyone the Emperor named enemy. Victory began to mean only that more bodies lay at his feet, that the wind over the dunes smelled of iron for a little longer. The horror here is quiet, like a blade sliding back into its sheath after it has already done its work. There came a point where the line between defender and conqueror was not merely blurred, it was gone, erased by orders obeyed and cities razed. When the Darken War finally turned Shurima against its own gods, Aatrox learned what it meant to be feared by those he had once protected. Mages and priests bound his vast, howling essence into the steel that had been his symbol. Imagine the insult, a general of the heavens reduced to a prison no larger than a man's arm, passed from soldier to soldier as plunder. Let the details move past you like drifting ash. A young warrior on some nameless battlefield gripping the hilt, feeling only weight and balance, never the screaming mind pressed thin inside the metal. Here is the pattern interrupt. Some cursed beings dream of escape so they can live. Atrox dreamed of escape so he could die. When the seals frayed and he learned to pour himself into mortal hosts, he did not slip in gently. He flooded them. Flesh swelled and tore, bones twisted into jagged wings, faces stretched into masks that mocked the noble visage he once bore in gold leaf. Each new body became a grotesque echo of the ascended hero, built solely to stride into wars vast enough, terrible enough, that perhaps some greater power, some final blade might unmake him at last. He is not deluded, that is the deepest cut. Atrox is fully conscious of what he has become, a self-aware catastrophe dragging unwilling spirits with him into carnage. His rage is not only for the world that chained him, but for the memory of the man who stepped into ascension believing in sacrifice, in brothers in arms, in a land worth saving. Every time he bellows for the end of all things, you can hear it if you listen closely. He is calling for an end to himself. And as we move from this fallen god to other champions, whose choices shattered their souls, remember him as a warning that even the brightest saviour can become the loudest prayer for oblivion. Pantheon. When a god dies and leaves a man behind, allow the night to grow a little deeper. The last echoes of Atrox's roar fade, and in the silence that follows, you are left with a different kind of fallen divinity, not a darkened blade howling for oblivion, but a mountain-born soldier who once believed the sky itself had chosen him. In a world as wide as Runeterra, there are many ways to flee your own smallness. Some drink, some pray, some throw themselves into war until the blood drowns out thought. Atreus climbed, step after step up Targon's impossible face. Lungs burning, fingers torn, he chased the promise that the aspects whispered, become more than a man, become the spear of the heavens, become the hand of war itself. You think you know this story, do you not? A mortal proves worthy, a god descends, and the rest is glory. That was how Atreus understood it when the aspect of war filled him. The world sharpened. Enemies became equations. His body, once bruised and breakable, moved like a verdict. Every heartbeat carried the weight of constellations. He looked down on the land he loved and believed with a terrible certainty that he had been right to seek this. That being a vessel was the purest form of courage because a god could not doubt. Then came Atrox. Not as a legend etched in old stone, but as a screaming red-lit presence on the battlefield, a Darkin who had once been ascended and now wore mortal bodies like wet, disposable armour. Blade met blade, starfire met ruin, and in that collision something impossible happened. The aspect of war died, not banished, not weakened, killed. The horror here is quiet, like a blade sliding back into its sheath after it has already done its work. Atreus fell from the sky, not as a comet, but as a man. Imagine the impact not on rock, but on mind. One moment you remember what it is to feel your veins carry starlight. The next you wake in the snow with broken ribs and shaking hands, your spirit still reaching for a power that is simply gone. The same enemies remain. Darkin, aspects, titans that stride across the land as if your villages are dust motes. Only now you can feel the cold. You can feel fear. You can feel how small your blade truly is. Most would have let that be the end. Let the details move past you like drifting ash. A failed vessel, a forgotten name, another corpse on Targon's slopes. Atreus does something worse and braver. He stands. He takes the name Pantheon, the god's old title, and wears it as an accusation rather than a halo. No aspect moves his limbs now. Only scar tissue, rage, and a human refusal to yield. He hunts Darkin with a shield that splinters, with a spear that can miss, with knees that buckle when the wind shifts wrong. His tragedy is not that he lost divinity. It is that he remembers it. Every time he raises his weapon against beings who bend reality, he knows, with a clarity sharper than steel, that he should not be able to win. Yet he walks into those wars regardless, not as destiny incarnate, but as a man who has seen the ceiling of existence and chooses to fight in the basement. This is courage stripped of myth, harsh, exhausted, and painfully honest. And as we move to other souls shattered by gods and empires, keep Atreus in mind, because some of them were never even offered a mountain to climb before the heavens broke them. Kyle and Morgana, sisters torn between heaven and earth. So you leave the mortal climbing a dead god's spine and descend in thought to a quieter height, not a mountain but a kingdom that wanted to be one. Demacia, white-stoned and certain, where law is a kind of prayer and disobedience is treated like a stain. Allow the night to grow a little deeper and listen, because here justice did not simply fail. It split into two daughters. In a world as wide as Runeterra, divinity does not always arrive as thunder. Sometimes it comes as a woman who falls from the sky and tries for a time to live as though she were merely human. Kyle and Morgana are born of such a mother, a Targonian aspect of justice, and a mortal father who tills the land and bleeds when he works. From the first breath they are divided, one hand reaching upward toward the cold star that birthed them, the other pressed downward into the soil that raised them. You think you know this story, do you not? Winged sister of light, winged sister of shadow, a simple tale of angel and fallen angel. Let the details move past you like drifting ash, and you will miss the horror. Their mother leaves, pulled back to the high, unblinking will of Targon. Their father remains fragile and earnest, trying to teach them that justice is not only a verdict, but a meal shared, a field defended, a neighbour forgiven. Between those absences and efforts, the girls learn that they are each half complete, each carrying a wound shaped like the other parent. Kaylee hears the call first. The aspect's power crowns her in burning armour, blades of living fire singing of order, of law, of purity that does not bend. She rises above Demacia, literally, wings gilded and distant, measuring men by their obedience rather than their hunger or their fear. The horror here is quiet, like a blade sliding back into its sheath after it has already done its work. In seeking to protect the kingdom from chaos, she begins to see only crimes, not reasons, sinners, not spirits, a land to be scoured, not healed. Morgana chooses the opposite sky. She binds her wings in iron, dragging divinity down into the dust, and walks among farmers and fugitives who whisper about mage hunts and Damatian prisons. She feels their pain as if it were her own, lets their grief and resentment soak into her, and calls that empathy justice. For this she is named traitor, accused of consorting with the impure, of loving mortals more than the star that made her. Their mother's abandonment hangs between them like a verdict with no appeal. Their father's frailty reminds them that mortality breaks beneath both tyranny and anarchy. Kylie believes she honours them by becoming more than human. Morgana believes she honours them by refusing to be anything else. Each is right, each is wrong. Each looks at the other and sees the missing half they cannot accept. When war and fear rise in Demacia, when mage and soldier clash in streets that once felt safe, the sisters step forward not as allies, but as opposing sentences. Kylie descends as executioner. Morgana stands as shield. In trying to save their people, they make enemies of their own blood, turning sisterhood into a battlefield where no victory can be clean. Every clash of their blades is really a question. Is a flawless law worth a broken heart? The tragedy is that neither can fully answer. Kylie cannot unlearn mercy. Morgana cannot wholly abandon judgment. So they circle, year after year, like two halves of a sundered god, each convinced that if the other would just yield, the world would finally be made whole. But Runeterra is not kind to divided souls, and as we move from these sisters of heaven and earth to those who drowned an entire kingdom for love, you will see how often the desire to save becomes the hand that ruins. Damasia's bright cage. When a kingdom turns its heroes into ghosts, love drowned a kingdom once. In another corner of Runeterra, something gentler does the same, work more slowly. Allow the night to grow a little deeper and lift your eyes from ruined coasts and spectral kings to a land that gleams even in darkness, where marble catches moonlight and banners hang so straight they might as well be blades. Demacia is what happens when a nation looks in the mirror and falls in love with its own reflection. White stone, ordered streets, armour polished until it blinds, a choir of trumpets that seems to promise you safety with every note. From a distance it feels like the answer to war, discipline instead of chaos, honour instead of cruelty, law instead of whim. In a world as wide as this, you are meant to believe that if anywhere can be pure, it is here. But purity is a blade with no hilt. You cannot hold it without bleeding. The horror here is quiet, like a commandment spoken so often it no longer sounds like a choice. Demacia's laws do not simply discourage magic. They criminalize it, name it a contagion, a rot to be cut out before it spreads. Mage seekers ride at dawn. Doors are broken. Children are dragged into the street while neighbours watch from behind curtains, weighing fear against compassion, deciding which spirit of the land they will serve. You think you know this story, do you not? Noble soldiers, shining citadels, a kingdom that stands against darker powers. Let the details move past you like drifting ash, and you might miss the way families are split along lines of birth alone. Brothers taught that one spark in the wrong sibling turns blood into liability. Informants are not monsters. They are parents who want their remaining children to live, captains who believe that one arrest today prevents a war tomorrow. The walls rise higher. The air grows thinner. Within those walls, tragedy is not an invader. It is an artisan. It takes a dutiful boy named Garin and gives him a sister whose very existence is treason. He becomes the sword of Demacia, the exemplar, the man who believes in law so fiercely that his love must learn to hide from it. Lux smiles, laughs, plays the role of perfect daughter while light curls around her fingers in locked rooms. A secret sunrise that could have made her people stronger if they were not so afraid of dawn. And then there is Silas, the child who did what Demacia told him to do. Point to the mages, help keep the kingdom safe. Chains as reward, years of captivity as the price for being born wrong. When he breaks those chains, he does not become a monster from outside the walls. He becomes the echo of what the walls have done, turning their own fear back upon them in fire and shattered stone. Here, the enemy is not just Noxus at the gate or Voidspawn in the dark. It is the certainty that virtue requires a prison, that safety demands a scapegoat. Demacia manufactures its tragic champions by putting honour and blood on opposite sides of the same line until protectors must choose which to betray. In the next breath, we will follow those choices to their end, to exiles who still wear Demacia's colours in their hearts, to martyrs who die believing the dream that killed them was worth the wound. Love as a loaded gun, Lucian Senna, and the lantern that wouldn't let go. So let us follow one of those martyrs past the grave into a different kind of service. Allow the night to grow a little deeper. The Demacian banners fall away, and you find yourself instead on a shattered coastline where the wind tastes of salt and old sorrow, where the sea keeps bringing back what the land tried to bury. Here, love itself learns what it means to become a weapon. In a world as wide as Runeterra, not every war is fought between kingdoms. Some are fought between a promise and the thing that tears it apart. Lucian and Senna begin as you might wish all lovers to begin, side by side, blades and guns drawn against the dark, sentinels of light who believe that if they can just banish enough wraiths, if they can just outlast the ruination's echoes, there will be a quiet life at the end of the road. Their story opens not with horror, but with competence, with trust, with the gentle certainty that tomorrow is still theirs to shape. You think you know this story, do you not? 2 hunters, 1 marriage, 1 shared crusade. Yet the horror here is quiet, like a blade sliding back into its sheath after it has already done its work. Thresh does not simply kill Senna. He performs a kind of spiritual surgery, reaching past flesh to seize the soul itself, dragging her into the green radiance of his lantern. In that instant, Lucian's world narrows. The land, the sea, the sky all collapse into a single image, his wife's essence trapped behind glass, screaming in a language only grief can hear. From there, the years do not pass so much as grind. Lucian keeps chasing the warden through ruined chapels and mist-choked alleys, each victory against lesser spectres reduced to a footnote in a longer, lonelier scripture. His guns grow heavier, his voice grows quieter. The Sentinel's broader mission, the balance between life and death, the spirits that still need guiding hands, these become distant concerns compared to the glow of that lantern he cannot reach. Every shot he fires is a prayer and a threat. Every night ends the same way, with Senna still gone. When he finally shatters the prison and wrenches her free, the story should end. It does not. Senna returns breathing, but she is not merely restored. She is remade, her veins threaded with black mist, her shadow holding shapes that do not belong to her alone. She carries voices with her, memories that are not hers. A whole drowned kingdom's worth of unfinished business coiled around her spirit. Lucian has his wife back, but not the woman he buried in his heart. That is the tragedy. His dream was always restoration, a return to a before that no longer exists. Their love survives, but altered, scarred, forced into a new shape where husband and wife must also be comrades, anchors, and witnesses to each other's haunting. What does it mean to hold someone whose death never ended, whose war now lives inside her? Let the details move past you like drifting ash, because from here we move deeper into the ruination's wake, to a king whose grief did not stop at 1 life, or 1 land, or even 1 century. Thresh, the archivist of suffering and the horror of perfect memory. Allow the night to grow a little deeper. We have followed a king whose grief drowned a kingdom. Now you must meet the man who learned to bottle that drowning, to catalogue it, to make of sorrow not a warning but a weapon. In a world as wide as Runeterra, every tragedy leaves a stain. Thresh is what happens when someone decides those stains should be preserved, labelled, and lovingly arranged. You think you know this story, do you not? The hook, the lantern, the laughing spectre on the shadow isles. But before the black mist peeled his flesh away, he was a man of the Blessed Isles, a warden and a scholar walking marble halls, where the living whispered around shelves of the dead. His duty was simple: guard the vaults, tend the archives. Yet, even then, his gaze lingered not on names and dates, but on the margins of each record, on the hints of fear in a final testament, on the single shaking line where a hand betrayed the mind's last terror. The horror here is quiet, like a blade sliding back into its sheath after it has already done its work. Thresh's fascination was never with justice, only with experience. What did the condemned think in their last hour? What did the bereaved dream when sleep finally took them? What secret compromises did heroes make in corridors no one else would ever see. While other wardens walked their rounds, he walked the corridors of confession, coaxing out memories, prizing them loose, turning them over in his thoughts as a jeweller turns a gem to the light. Then came Viego, the ruination, the vaults torn open by a king's refusal to accept a single grave. When the black mist howled through those sacred halls, it did not so much corrupt Thresh as set him free, stripping away the last thin membrane of human shame that had once made him close his eyes. Where others screamed and dissolved, he inhaled. Where others lost themselves, he found clarity. The warden became a spirit without weight or end, yet his archivist's instinct remained, sharpened and unbound. His lantern is not merely a prison, it is a library. Each soul he drags from the dark is a volume bound in its own history, shelved in green fire. Within that glass, memories do not blur with time. They can be replayed, rewound, re-edited, their worst moments isolated and magnified. A lover's last argument, a soldier's one act of cowardice, a child's choice to look away. Thresh flips through them, as you might turn pages, annotating with fresh agony where the ink of the past begins to fade. Consider Lucian and Senna, whose story you may think is about a gun and a rescue. To Thresh they are not enemies, they are a masterpiece in progress. He does not simply kill Senna, he curates her. He selects which of her fears to keep close, which hopes to let flicker just bright enough to hurt. He allows Lucian's rage to grow, then cool, then grow again, trimming it like a gardener tending a cruel dark rose. Husband and wife become exhibits in a single shared case. One soul trapped, one soul orbiting, both defined by a wound that never scars. In his hands, perfect memory is the true curse. Most wars end when the survivors forget enough to sleep. Most brothers reconcile, if at all, because the edges of old words soften with distance. But inside that lantern, there is no distance. Every regret is forever firstborn. Every scream is forever fresh. Thresh can take a moment of weakness and replay it until it becomes a person's only truth, can take a kingdom's fall and refine it into a parable of despair that will outlast the stones of its last tower. You walk through the shadow aisles and think you hear the wind. What you are hearing is editing, the quiet scrape of an archivist rearranging an endless shelf of suffering. And if tragedy can be kept that sharp, that precise, what happens when someone like Thresh decides to open his archives and share them with the living? Is the ruined king, Viego and the catastrophe of a love that refused to end. You think you know this story, do you not? King, queen, poisoned cup, a kingdom swallowed by shadow. Let the details move past you like drifting ash for a moment, and listen instead to the quiet shape of it. A boy handed a crown he did not earn, a love so absolute it left no room for a world as wide as Runeterra, and a single refusal that drowned an age. Viego is that boy, young, untested, a king in name before he was a man in spirit. He sits a little crooked on the jade throne of Camavor, fingers more used to tracing Isolde's cheek than to gripping a blade or signing decrees that send men to war. His identity narrows, tightens, coils around her, not king and queen, but lover and beloved, with an empire as a dim, inconvenient backdrop. In a world as wide as this land of rival banners and restless dead, he believes he has found the one safe, untouchable thing. Then the arrow flies. Then the poison blooms. Isolde's death is not noble. It is messy, frightened, full of fever and failed remedies. A queen slipping beneath bathwater gone red while physicians mutter and the palace wind carries the smell of panic through its halls. Viego does not accept it, cannot. Mortality feels like an insult, like treason committed by the universe itself, and so he turns his face toward the blessed isles, toward whispered relics and forbidden rites, and he measures the cost only in distance, never in lives. The horror here is quiet, like a blade sliding back into its sheath after it has already done its work. A king arrives as a supplicant, but when the guardians of the isles refuse to unmake death for him, he does not bow, he breaks, he tears through sacred libraries, shatters oaths as if they were glass, and follows the trail of legend to the waters of life. The resurrection fails. Isolde wakes just long enough to scream and strike, to reject the monstrous half-life forced upon her, and in that instant the vessel shatters, the black mist erupts, and paradise drowns. Temples crack, scholars choke on shadow. The blessed isles sink, and the world receives the shadow isles in their place, a monument not to love, but to a love that refused to end. Allow the night to grow a little deeper. Listen to the collateral. Callista, the loyal niece and general who sought peace, is betrayed and run through on her own king's order, then dragged back as the spear of vengeance, forever reliving the moment her faith was murdered. Hecarim, once a commander, is swallowed by the mist until only a centaur-shaped hunger remains, hooves pounding through an endless, formless war. Thousands of nameless souls hang in the dark, histories erased or twisted into hunting grounds for Thresh and his brothers in cruelty, each spirit a page torn from a book that will never be read. What do you do with a man like this? Viego is both victim and architect, a fragile heart shattered by grief and the hand that pulled the world down around it. His sorrow was real, his devotion undeniable, but somewhere between the deathbed and the ruined shore, love became indistinguishable from selfishness, from the conviction that no one else's life, no land, no spirit, no future mattered beside his private agony. The ruined king is not simply a tyrant in spectral armour. He is a warning that the most catastrophic monsters are sometimes born not from hatred, but from a single unyielding refusal to let go. And out there, beyond the mist, others watch that warning drift across the sea, wondering if their own grief might one day learn to wear a crown. Callista, the spear of vengeance who died for loyalty. Twice allow the night to grow a little deeper as you follow that drifting crown back across the sea, to a kingdom already dying before the mist ever touched it. In a world as wide as Runeterra, not every ruin begins with a scream. Some begin with a vow spoken too earnestly by someone who believes the world can still be held together by loyalty alone. Callista was such a believer. Niece to King Viego, general of his armies, she moved across the land like a disciplined blade, sworn to protect both the crown and the realm it claimed to love. While courtiers whispered and schemed in perfumed halls, while war smouldered at the borders and rot spread through the royal court, she still tried to act with an almost old-fashioned honour, as if sheer integrity might be enough to steady a crumbling throne. The horror here is quiet, like a spirit watching from the rafters as the people it guards begin to devour one another. You think you know this story, do you not? A poisoned queen, a grieving king, a tragedy that spills outward into ruination. But before the black mist, there was a single soldier who refused to lie. When Isolde was struck down by treachery at a banquet table, it was Callista who rode through hostile territories and forbidden libraries, hunting for any cure the world might still remember. She found only half promises and dangerous rites, and when she returned, she chose to speak the truth. There was no salvation that did not demand a deeper corruption. That was her first betrayal, not of Viego, but by him. Faced with a choice between sanity and obsession, the king raised his hand against the one who had never failed him. In that throne room, no war, no spirit, No future mattered beside his private agony, and Callista's reward for her loyalty was a spear in her back, driven by the guards she herself had trained. Let the details move past you like drifting ash. The shocked intake of breath, the clatter of armour, the realization that the realm she bled for would rather murder its conscience than confront its own decay. Death should have been an ending. For her, it became a conscription. When the ruination tore through the Blessed Isles, Callista was dragged from whatever rest she had earned and reforged into the spear of vengeance, an undead huntress who hears the whispered oaths of the wronged like wind through broken banners. Now she comes when summoned by those who swear vengeance, driving spectral spears into oathbreakers, answering pleas for retribution with impeccable, merciless precision. But the horror here is quiet again, and cruel. Callista's sense of fairness, that rigid internal scale that once weighed the fate of kingdoms, is now chained to a curse that cannot easily distinguish between righteous redress and petty spite. A betrayed lover, a spurned merchant, a tyrant cloaking ambition in the language of justice, all can call her, and the land itself does not rise to correct her hand. She died trying to do the right thing, refusing to bend truth for a mad king, and in undeath she is condemned to keep killing for causes that may only pretend to be just. Every spear she throws is a question with no answer. Whose justice is this, and who pays its price? In another corner of the Shadow Isles, someone else heard that question and chose a very different kind of silence. Hecarim and Carthus, when death is just the first promotion. Someone heard Callista's question and did not flinch from the answer. Someone looked at the price of justice, of war, of simple mortal ending, and decided that if the land was going to stain him, it might as well carve him all the way through. Allow the night to grow a little deeper as we ride toward the man who became a cavalry of one. Hecarim was not made cruel by the ruination. He arrived already sharpened. As leader of the Iron Order, he took the chaos of war and treated it as a private hunting ground, driving his riders harder, faster, farther, not to defend a kingdom, but to feed the quiet hunger behind his visor. Villages were not objectives, they were demonstrations. Each charge was proof that he could bend men, horses, and history to his will. In a world as wide as Runeterra, some commanders dread the end of a campaign. Hecarim dreaded only the moment when there were no more enemies to trample. So when Viego's madness opened a door into the black mist, Hecarim did not hesitate. He led the vanguard into that roiling curtain, iron hooves striking the stone one last time as mortal things. And on the other side they were remade, flesh unstitched, armour fused to bone, rider and mount welded into a single spectral engine of slaughter. The horror here is quiet, like a blade sliding back into its sheath after it has already done its work. He got exactly what he had trained himself to desire, and now he can never dismount. You think you know this story, do you not? A warlord becomes a wraith and continues the war, but listen to how the wind moves when he rides, how the ground remembers each impact that no longer leaves hoofprints. Hecarim is condemned to the perfect campaign, no fatigue, no retreat, no peace. He is a storm of hooves and screams that never tires, the dream of total domination made into an unending night terror for the living. Carthus began at the opposite end of the blade. No banners, no cavalry. Just a boy in Zon's grey alleys, singing in a choir that echoed off stone walls while plague carts rolled by. Where others averted their eyes from the dead, he lingered. Graveyards were not warnings to him, but invitations. He would stand among crooked headstones and feel a strange serenity in the stillness, as if the world finally stopped demanding, stopped shouting, stopped choosing. Death to Carthus was not horror, but harmony. Let the details move past you like drifting ash, the way he traced names on tombstones, the way he listened for a spirit that might answer back. When he learned of the Shadow Isles, he did not flee as sailors' tales advised. He sought them, believing undeath to be a higher choir, a transcendence where the division between singer and song would dissolve. He was granted his wish. Now Carthus walks as a lich whose hymn carries through the mist, a prophet of oblivion who sings the world toward the same fate he chose. The tragedy is not that he was tricked. It is that the promise was kept. In undeath he discovered that the stillness he craved is not peace, but absence, an empty note held too long, erasing every other melody. Hecarim's fate is punishment shaped like his own ambition. Carthus's is devotion fulfilled until it hollows itself out. Out on the Shadow Isles their paths cross without meeting, the charge and the chant, the blade and the dirge, one riding down survivors while the other calls them to step willingly into the dark. And somewhere between hoofbeat and hymn, another kind of undeath waits, one that does not charge or sing, but simply takes. What happens when the horror no longer needs a rider or a choir? When the mask wears you, demons, fiddlesticks, and the shape of fear, it does not charge, it does not sing, it waits. In a world as wide as Runeterra, not every monster announces itself with hooves or hymns. Some arrive as a silence in the field, as a shape where no shape should stand, as the feeling that the night itself has decided to look back at you. The horror here is quiet, like a blade sliding back into its sheath after it has already done its work. To understand it, you must first understand what demon means in this land. Not a species, not a mere spirit with sharper teeth. In Runeterra, demons are ideas given hunger, vices, and terrors distilled until they can walk. There is one for insatiable appetite that fattens itself on famine and greed. There is one for deception that feeds on every lie told between lovers, brothers, and kings. They do not simply frighten or tempt. They feed on the very fear, the very craving, the very falsehood they inspire, circling war and grief the way carrion birds circle a battlefield. Allow the night to grow a little deeper, out beyond the last farmhouse where scarecrows lean over dead furrows. Something older than kingdoms wears a body like a borrowed coat. Fiddlesticks is not a scarecrow that came to life. It is an absence that found a shape, an ancient prehistoric hunger for terror itself, drawn to places where the land remembers screaming, battlefields where Damatian steel met Noxian machines, ruined Ixtali sites where magic went wrong, shattered Ionian shrines where the wind still tastes of war. You think you know this story, do you not? A horror in the corn, a children's tale to keep them close to the fire. But Fiddlesticks does not simply leap from the dark. It listens, it learns, it reflects. When it comes wearing you. It drags the last words it heard from a dying soldier's throat and plays them back in that same trembling voice. It calls to a fugitive mage in the tones of a Damasian mother, promising forgiveness. It repeats a commander's final order to hold the line, and men rise from cover believing, for one fatal heartbeat, that their captain still lives. Let the details move past you, like drifting ash. A lantern dropped in the mud, a line of footprints that begin in the middle of a road. A terrified survivor swearing he heard his brother's voice from inside the thing's chest. Fiddlesticks turns the mind's own fear into its sharpest weapon, forcing you to doubt your senses, your memories, your dead. The tragedy it leaves is not a ruin you can rebuild. Those who survive such encounters do not merely flinch at shadows. Their dreams have been colonized. No healing magic, no Ionian spirit rite, No Targonian blessing can quite reach the place where that mimicry lives. They wake to the sound of loved ones calling from the dark, to the echo of their own begging played back at them. Some champions carry wounds like this: a Noxian veteran who will not sleep indoors, an Ionian warden who hears children crying in empty courtyards, a Damacian mage hunter who now fears his own reflection more than sorcery. Their tragedy is no longer only what they did or what was done to them. It is what moved in afterward and never left. When fear itself becomes an occupant, when a demon has learned the exact pitch of your grief, what part of you is still entirely your own? Devoured from within, the void and the erasure of self. There is a deeper loss than possession. There is a silence that does not merely move in, but wipes the name from the door. Allow the night to grow a little deeper and look past demons and curses to something far colder, far more patient, waiting beneath the floorboards of reality itself. In a world as wide as Runeterra, most horrors still acknowledge that you exist. A demon needs your fear. A spectre needs your regret. Even undeath, with all its cruelty, preserves too much, faces grudges, the echo of a voice caught between breaths. The void is different. The void is not a kingdom, not a god, not a distant land. It is an absence that behaves like a presence, a hunger from outside the story that wants to unmake form, memory, and meaning until even the word was no longer fits. The horror here is quiet, like a blade sliding back into its sheath after it has already done its work. It does not roar at first, it whispers. It seeps in as a strange impulse, a dissonant wind in the mind, a colour that does not belong in this spectrum. It corrupts by degrees, first a doubt, then a mutation, then the slow replacement of every personal desire with a single directive that feels less like thought and more like gravity. Consume, spread, erase. You think you know this story, do you not? A Shuriman guide named Kassadin, a dutiful man of the desert, descends in search of his missing daughter and returns wearing blades that are not entirely his own, his voice carrying the resonance of a place that should never have been found. A child named Kaisar falls through the skin of the world and survives only by fusing with a living carapace that eats as easily as it protects, each battle pulling her a fraction further from the girl her father once knew. A prophet, Malzahar, hears something in the cracks of a ruined city and kneels, and when he rises, his prayers no longer concern mercy or justice, but the efficient erasure of the world he once tried to heal. These are not simply champions with strange powers. They are people whose lives were shattered by contact with the void, pressed into roles they never sought, conscripted into a war that does not even recognize the word war, because that would imply two sides. Let the details move past you like drifting ash and notice the shape that remains. Each of them walks, speaks, chooses, yet each carries within their spirit a growing region where choice has already been deleted. That is the specific horror. Undeath traps you in a single moment of suffering, but at least you remain to suffer. The void promises something more absolute, more obscene. It does not merely kill. It edits. It threatens to preserve nothing at all, to turn tragedy itself into a blank space where a person used to be, as if the land, the wind, and every brother and lover who remembered them were gently instructed to forget. So, the void-touched become walking warnings, moving absences framed in mortal shape, living evidence of what happens when the universe itself decides your story should be deleted. They fight, some of them, to hold on to a name, a face, a single remembered promise. For now, they still leave footprints. For now, they still cast shadows. But if this is what the first brush of that outer hunger looks like, What will it mean when the curtain lifts fully and there is nothing left to resist at all? Kindred, the only ending that never lies, when the curtain of the void threatens to erase every story, you might think the only terror left is nothingness. But Runeterra has always known another certainty, older than any watcher, quieter than any cosmic scream. Allow the night to grow a little deeper. Listen past the howling dark, and you will hear a softer sound, a bowstring drawn, a low growl in the brush, a children's rhyme about two shapes that come for everyone. Kindred are not a god, but a grammar, the final punctuation at the end of every sentence. Lamb and wolf, white mask and hungry muzzle, gentle hand and rushing jaws. Sometimes death stands at the bedside and offers you one last breath to choose your ending. Sometimes death bursts from the tree line and does not ask. In a world as wide as this land of wars and wandering spirits, they are the only pair who never break their word. You think you know this story, do you not? Death as villain, as thief, as the blade that robs you of tomorrows. Yet, unlike demons that bargain or the void that devours, kindred do not tempt, and they do not hate. They are inevitability given form, the last honest promise in a world where kings swear peace and start wars, where brothers swear loyalty and raise blades, where oaths rot faster than unburied corpses. The horror here is quiet, like a lantern being gently closed, like a hand letting go. To see their shape more clearly, you must look toward the shadow isles, where that promise was broken and twisted. Thresh does not allow endings. He feeds on delay. His chains bite into spirits like Callista's, like the nameless dead of Camavor, and he drags them past the point where even regret should fade. Where kindred loose the arrow and let the spirit fall free, Thresh hooks it mid-flight and stuffs it screaming into a lantern, turning mercy into exhibit, grief into currency. Hecarim rides through that black fog, hooves never tiring, armour never rusting, each raid a repetition of the same sin. Karthus sings hymns that do not conclude, a choir of those who should have been allowed to rest. Undeath is not life, it is a sentence without a period, a war drum that cannot stop beating. Kindred pass by these shores, or perhaps they cannot reach them, and that absence is its own kind of cruelty. Consider Atrox, once a radiant ascended, now hijacking mortal bodies, only to burn them out in borrowed rage. He rages because even when he wins, he loses the one thing every soldier secretly counts on, that one day the wind will stop, the blade will fall from their fingers, and the story will close. Callista, betrayed by the king she served, should have met Lamb's gaze and stepped into whatever judgment awaited. Instead, she is locked in a single moment of vengeance, javelin forever mid-flight. The tragedy for these cursed champions is not only what they endure, but what they are denied. For a peasant in Dalmatia, for a Noxian footman, for a nameless Ionian archer whose spirit the land will remember, death is still an exit, however narrow. For Atrox, for Hecarim, for the souls in Thresh's collection, even that door has been barred. Their horror is not loud. It is the dawning realization that the one mercy everyone else receives will never come for them. So what happens, you might ask, when something tries to break even kindred's promise, when the last honest ending is challenged by powers that refuse to let go? The body, as battleground, Cain and Rast's slow possession. It happens in a quieter place than a battlefield, not on a rampart, not beneath a collapsing sky, but in the small private country beneath a single ribcage. When something tries to break kindred's promise, it does not begin with a roar. It begins with a whisper that no one else can hear. In a world as wide as Runeterra, some children are born already half-claimed by war. Cain is one of those. You see him first not as a scythe-wielding terror, but as a boy in Noxian chains, a weapon in training, learning that the only language that matters is pain translated into obedience. When Zed's shadows cut him free, it is a rescue, yes, but also a recruitment. The order he joins will teach him that the blade is truth, that the land is merely a board on which stronger spirits rearrange weaker lives. Under Zed's eye, Cain becomes a prodigy, fast, precise, unquestioning. Sometimes it comes in the shape of duty. Sometimes it wears the mask of honour. Sometimes the most terrible monster in a life is a single choice that feels like destiny. For Cain, that moment waits in an ancient buried weapon, Rast, a darkened scythe, sleeping like a curse that has learned patience. You think you know this story, do you not? Boy finds artifact, grows stronger, becomes the assassin his master always needed. Let the details move past you like drifting ash, and you might even miss the price. Rast is not a tool, he is an exiled warlord, a spirit of slaughter pressed into steel, who once strode Shurima as a god of red horizons. When Cain lifts him, he is not gripping a handle, he is offering his hand. The horror here is quiet, like a blade sliding back into its sheath after it has already done its work. In game, you see it as a choice on your screen: Shadow Assassin or Darkin, Blue Wind or Red Hunger, the boy or the parasite. Inside the shared body, it is not so clean. Shadow Assassin is Cain's ambition sharpening itself, vowing that he will master the Darkin and bend that ancient will to the order of shadow. Darkin is Rast's laughter, the moment the scythe stops being carried and begins to carry the man. Allow the night to grow a little deeper and listen. Rast is always speaking. He praises Cain's cruelty, mocks his hesitation, calls every kill a lesson and every hesitation a betrayal. This is not possession as a single violent seizure. It is a marriage of convenience becoming a hostile takeover, a duet where one voice grows louder each time blood touches steel. How long can you argue with someone who lives in your bones before you start borrowing their words? The tragedy is that Cain loves this, not Rast as a person, but what Rast offers. A future where no master can chain him, no war can make him a pawn, no death can interrupt his story. It is a love story gone wrong, devotion not to a brother or a homeland, but to the feeling of being untouchable. Every step toward that power is a step away from himself, until the question is no longer who will win, but whether there will be anything left of Cain to claim victory at all. And if one boy can become a battlefield, what happens when an entire kingdom wages its soul on power it cannot truly command? War's forgotten children, soldiers broken by the states. They served. When a single boy can become a battlefield, you have to ask what happens when the battlefield learns to speak, when kingdoms themselves begin to demand blood like a tithe. In a world as wide as Runeterra, war is not only fought by villains and monsters, it is carried on the backs of loyal men and women who walk where they are told, kill when they are ordered, and only later discover that the true horror was never the enemy in front of them, but the crest on their own shield. The horror here is quiet, like a blade sliding back into its sheath after it has already done its work. Think of Atreus, the man beneath the pantheon, who was chosen not for kindness or cruelty, but for usefulness, a body to wear a god the way a general wears armour. He climbs, he survives, he becomes the vessel of celestial war, and when that god shatters against Atrox's defiance, Atreus is left alone beneath a broken sky, nearly crushed by expectations that were never his to choose. The constellation moves on. The man must live with what it did in his name. Let the details move past you like drifting ash. A spear, a vow, a king's command. Callista rides into legend as the spear of vengeance, but before that she is simply a niece who tells an inconvenient truth, a general who refuses to lie about the queen's death. For that honesty, Viego kills her. For that loyalty, he condemns her to undeath, bound to hunt betrayers while serving the greatest betrayer she ever knew. Her tragedy is not random. It is the precise, logical end of a court that values its own illusion over the lives that uphold it. Allow the night to grow a little deeper, and listen to hooves that never tire. Hecarim leads the Iron Order, Damasia's shining court of honour and discipline, and on the Blessed Isles, he turns his own charge into a massacre, trampling soldiers and civilians alike beneath spectral cavalry. Yet, even before the ruination twists him, the pattern is there. A commander rewarded for brutality, a kingdom that wants victory more than virtue, a knight who learns that mercy is a weakness his superiors will quietly punish. The ruination does not create Hecarim so much as strip away the last human mask. You think you know this story, do you not? Noxus, the cruel aggressor, Ionia, the noble victim, Demacia, the righteous wall. But walk slower. Noxian soldiers are marched into unwinnable assaults as tests of strength, their deaths converted into lessons for officers who survive. Ionian defenders bleed on temple steps, while elders argue over doctrine and abandon them to improvisation and guilt. Damasian knights ride out to cage mages they pity, enforcing laws they privately despise because the crown has decided that fear is safer than trust. Nameless regiments vanish into the void. Their final screams are swallowed by chittering dark. Rank and file sailors drown in the ruination's black sea so that Viego's grief can keep reaching for a queen who will never answer. Every one of them believed in a banner, in a brother at their side, in a story where sacrifice meant something. Instead, their souls become fuel, spectral arrows in Callista's volleys, faceless wraiths in Hecarim's charge, echoes in Aatrox's stolen throats as he swings yet another mortal body toward a death that will not stay. This is the pattern beneath the armour, systems that prize conquest over conscience, ideology over individual breath. Every oath becomes a potential noose. Every uniform is a contract written in disappearing ink. And from here, the tragedy will narrow. We will leave the clamour of armies and step into quieter rooms where the battlefield is no longer a continent, but the distance between two people who once trusted each other and must now decide which matters more, their bond or the orders pressed into their shaking hands. Love as rupture. When intimacy becomes the sharpest weapon. From the clash of banners, you are led inward. The war outside grows muffled, as if the world is closing a door, and what remains is smaller, more intimate, and far more dangerous. Two hands reaching for each other in the dark, not yet knowing that the touch itself is the fuse. Allow the night to grow a little deeper. This is where the blade turns. Across Runeterra, love is praised as a shield, a source of strength, the thing that lets a soldier rise when the land and the spirit both say he should fall. Yet, under pressure, that same devotion becomes a fault line, a hairline fracture running through the heart, along which people do not bend. They break. The horror here is quiet, like a blade sliding back into its sheath after it has already done its work. You think you know this story, do you not? Lovers and brothers standing together against war, against monsters, against the cold machinery of fate. But watch what happens when the world leans its full weight on that bond. Lucian is not terrifying because he is a marksman. He is terrifying because every shot is a prayer and a promise, fired at the warden who keeps Senna's soul imprisoned in a lantern. His love gives him purpose. It also guarantees that every sunrise without her is another small ruination inside his chest. For Viego, the fracture widens into catastrophe. His devotion to Isolde begins as a soft thing, private and domestic, a king who would rather be a husband than a ruler. Yet, in a world as wide as this, where magic answers grief like dry tinder answers a spark, that tenderness mutates. Her death does not end their story. It detonates it. The ruination is not only a geopolitical disaster, not only an empire drowned in black mist. It is the echo of one man's refusal to let go of a single body on a single bed. Even bonds that are not romantic become blades, turned inward. Cain believes he can master Rast, wear the darken like a weapon, keep his will intact while the parasite whispers. Their intimacy is invasion, a voice under his skin, a presence in every motion of his hand. Kylie and Morgana are sisters, near to brothers in purpose once, yet their closeness makes each ideological wound a betrayal, each judgment a personal apocalypse. The more they loved, the more there was to burn. In Runeterra, love is not tested by distance. It is tested by war, by sorcery, by power imbalances that twist good intentions into harm until rescue becomes possession, protection becomes control, and grief becomes an excuse to unmake the world. Let the details move past you, like drifting ash, and ask yourself, in a land like this, is it even possible to love someone without endangering them? Because to answer that, we must walk into the black heart of one particular marriage, where a king's vow to his queen did not merely fail, it drowned an entire civilization. And the next door we open is the one that leads into the ruination itself. Inside the ruination, walking step by step through a kingdom's suicide note. You step through that door and the light changes. The air thickens, as if even the wind hesitates to move around this memory. In a world as wide as Runeterra, entire wars can be forgotten, but a single marriage like this refuses to fade. It glows like a coal at the bottom of history's throat. Before the ruination is a legend, it is just two people. Viego is not yet the half-rotten king you know from the Rift. He is a young man too soft for a crown, a boy who should have been a minor prince, and nothing more. Isolde is the painter who becomes his centre of gravity, the one presence that steadies his hands and quiets the tremor in his spirit. Court whispers grow sharp. Advisers watch the way his gaze never leaves her. How decrees stall if she is ill. How state matters bend around the small orbit of one woman's smile. The horror here is quiet, like a blade sliding back into its sheath after it has already done its work. When the assassin's knife finds Isolde, it is almost mundane. A poisoned edge in a marketplace, a brush of contact that feels like an accident until she begins to fade. You think you know this story, do you not? A healer is summoned, then another, hands shaking over tinctures that fail one by one. Advisers murmur of succession, of stability, of what a king must accept. Viego hears only the rattle in his wife's breath and the word no burning through his veins. Allow the night to grow a little deeper. Watch his choices harden. The Blessed Isles are not yet shrouded. They are a sanctuary, a land where death is studied, not defied. When Viego demands the waters of life, priests and wardens speak of balance, of the danger of forcing the dead back into their bodies, of spirits that do not forget being dragged from the quiet. He dismisses them. 1,000 lives for one, he argues, is not a sacrifice but an equation. What is a distant civilization weighed against the woman on his bed? Amumu, the ritual answers him. Isolde rises but wrong, her mouth shaping a scream that does not sound like language, her eyes reflecting not recognition, but a fractured world behind the glass. The waters recoil, reality itself buckling as if the land has been stabbed. Let the details move past you like drifting ash. Glass exploding inward, Priests turn to wailing silhouettes, the first fingers of black mist clawing out of the well. It spreads like ink dropped into clear water, veining through streets, into homes, through armour and bone. Each tendril carries more than death. It carries the echo of that single refusal to let go, a king's voice saying mine to a corpse. And as the aisles drown, you are left with a question that will follow us into the next shadow. If love can do this, what hope does any champion have of dying clean? The quiet ones, tragedy in champions, we don't think about. So you sit with that question, and the sea around the shadow isles feels endless. But you and I both know the shoreline of horror does not end there. In a world as wide as Runeterra, not every tragedy announces itself with a crown of mist or a continent sinking beneath black waves. Some of it walks beside you in Champion Select, painted in bright colours, sold with a catchy theme song, hiding a lifetime of quiet ruin beneath a small, sad smile. The horror here is quiet, like a blade sliding back into its sheath after it has already done its work. Consider a muumuu, whom you have perhaps dismissed as a mascot of misfortune, a harmless spirit of lost games and light-hearted grief. The story beneath the bandages is not loud. It is the image of a child king who cannot remember his own beginning, cursed so that anyone who loves him is broken by that love, or simply forgets him as though he were never there at all. Imagine that. Every embrace you attempt dissolving, every bond rotting away into fear, madness, or blank indifference. You think you know this story, do you not? You see a tiny mummy dancing in a lane, and you do not see centuries of wandering palace ruins where his name has been chiselled off the stone, or the way the land itself recoils from his touch. His curse is not a cinematic explosion, it is repetition. Wake, hope, reach for another hand, watch it slip again and again, until even despair becomes a kind of ritual, a pattern worn smooth by endless use. Allow the night to grow a little deeper, and look toward Demacia, where the banners are bright and the songs are proud. Shivana stands there, half dragon, half woman, entirely out of place in a kingdom that worships purity and fears what it cannot control. She serves a prince, fights Demacia's wars, throws her scaled body between human flesh and dragonfire, and yet each victory only resets the test. Loyalty proved yesterday does not purchase trust for tomorrow. She is always the weapon, never the brother, never truly of the circle she protects. Then your gaze must cross the water again, back to those drowned isles, but lower, quieter, away from kings and generals. There you find Yorick, last of an order whose purpose was once merciful, to guide spirits from this world into the next, to keep graves tended so the living could sleep. Now the ruination has turned that calling into a sentence. He walks through an entire continent's worth of restless dead, shoveling, praying, carrying a faith that yields no visible result, no lessening of the tide. For him, there is no duel, no final war, only labour. Let the details move past you like drifting ash, and a pattern emerges. Not every horror is a crown of thorns or a shattered sky. Some are these slow, repetitive burdens. The child no one remembers, the guardian no one fully accepts, the shepherd with a flock that will never stop arriving. As we move forward, keep them in mind and ask yourself, the next time you laugh at a light-hearted skin or a comic voice line, what hidden cost, what unseen midnight might be standing just behind it, waiting for the moment the music stops? Cosmic indifference. When the stars themselves don't care if you break. So let the music fade and allow the night to grow a little deeper. We have walked among forgotten children and unthanked guardians. Now you must lift your eyes higher, far above any city wall or battlefield grave. to a place where tragedy is measured not in villages burned, but in lifetimes casually rewritten by the sky itself. Targon is not just a mountain, it is a blade pointed upward, a stone altar on which the heavens lay their hands. You do not simply climb it. It chooses you, drags you through wind and ice and thinning air until your lungs burn and your spirit frays. And if you reach the summit, you do not come back alone. You come back as an aspect, a moving aperture through which some distant star peers down at the land and decides what must be done. You think you know this story, do you not? Radiant Leona, stoic shield of the sun. Pale Diana, moonlit heretic, scythe flashing like a crescent tear in the night. Yet behind the splash art, there are broken friendships and shattered certainties, because when a celestial will pause itself into a mortal frame, it does not politely ask where your loyalties lie. It overwrites them. Leona's vows to her order, her quiet human affections, are bent toward an unblinking solar purpose. Diana's doubt, her yearning to understand the forgotten side of their faith, is fanned into a lunar rebellion that leaves no room for a simple, ordinary life. In a world as wide as Runeterra, this is another kind of horror, not the demon that tempts you, nor the tyrant that threatens you, but the impersonal command that simply assumes you will obey. Entire lives are reoriented around duties never fully consented to, as if the moment you touched that summit, your previous griefs and desires became childish toys to be put away. The horror here is quiet, like a blade sliding back into its sheath after it has already done its work. You are alive, you are powerful, and yet the person who once laughed, doubted, loved, is treated as a footnote in their own body. And then there is Atreus, not chosen in the same way, not a perfect vessel, but a man whose flesh once housed Pantheon's indomitable war spirit, and then survived its death. His tragedy is stranger. He has seen the stars from the inside and returned to the dirt. He knows, with a clarity that keeps him awake at night, that the constellations do not hate him. They do not forgive him. They simply do not notice him at all. That is the true cosmic terror of Targon. Unlike Viego's grief or Adarkin's hunger, there is no obsession here, no personal vendetta. The sun and moon burn Leona and Diana's lives away in their private war of doctrine. The aspect of war abandons Atreus when he breaks, then leaves him to crawl on with nothing but a mortal body and an impossible memory. Let the details move past you like drifting ash, and ask yourself, what does a man fight for? Once he has learned that the sky itself is indifferent to his courage. Runeterra after dark does not end at the mountaintop. There are other powers, older voids and hungrier shadows, waiting where even starlight fails, and some champions do not just carry those powers. They are eaten from the inside out by them, piece by piece. Identity as a battlefield. When you are the mask, you cannot remove some prisons, do not look like chains at all. They look like names, like titles, like the way a crowd's eyes fix on you and refuse to see anything else. Allow the night to grow a little deeper, and you will notice that in Runeterra, the worst cages are carved into the spirit, not the stone. Atrox was once a hero etched on sunlit murals, an ascended whose very presence turned the tide of war. Yet what walks now beneath his name is a parasite of living metal, hijacking mortal bodies just to feel the illusion of his own death. Cain, the prodigy assassin, carries Rast the Darkin like a blade carries rust. Slowly, patiently, the corruption spreads, until you cannot quite remember where the steel ends and the stain begins. You think you know this story, do you not? The ambitious student, the whispering weapon, the inevitable fall. But the horror here is quiet, like a voice in your head that never sleeps and never stops calling itself you. Atreus was a shepherd's son before he was a constellation's vessel, a man who climbed a mountain and came back, bearing the name Pantheon, as if it were a victory rather than an occupation. When the god within him died, the title did not. It clung to his flesh, to his legend, to the way others knelt or fled at the sight of his helm, until the man beneath had to learn to move as a myth he no longer believed in. Viego too became less a person than a curse. The ruined king is not a crown, but a verdict, a phrase that turns every step he takes into an echo of the day his grief drowned a kingdom. In a world as wide as this war-torn land, even those who seem in control are not spared. Swain holds a demon in the hollow of his severed arm, black feathers and burning eyes coiled through his veins, each vision and stratagem suspect because he cannot be sure where his own will ends and the raven's hunger begins. Lysandra rules the Freljord from within a palace of lies so deep that her very memory has been edited by her own deceit. She is trapped in a history she herself rewrote, a prisoner pacing inside a story that no longer has a door. Here, the metaphor of the mask fails, because the mask has grown into the skin. To tear it away would be to strip Aatrox down to the screaming nothing he fears, to leave Cain or Rast without a body, to unmake Atreus's borrowed divinity until only a tired soldier remains, staring at a sky that will not answer. Let the details move past you like drifting ash. The morning you wake and hear a second breath in your chest, the moment a stranger greets you by a title that tastes like ash on your tongue, the battlefield where your own face on a banner feels like a lie. Pattern interrupt. What if the mask is all that is left? If Swain's demon were torn free, would there be a general or only a broken veteran? If Lysandra spoke one unvarnished truth, would her empire or herself survive the impact? The horror here is quiet because it asks you to imagine waking each day to a destiny you did not choose, yet must perform flawlessly or watch worlds burn. Every brother to a weapon, every host to a god, every monarch to a legend moves inside that cage. So we arrive at a harder question, one that will follow us into the next part of this story. In a land where so many are devoured by their roles, what does resistance look like when the role is fused to your bones? What does acceptance mean when it sounds like surrender? And is there, somewhere between those blades of choice, a way to carve meaning inside the mask without tearing your own spirit apart? Who suffers most? Ranking tragedy in a world built on it. So if roles can devour a soul from the inside, you arrive at a darker calculus, one you almost hesitate to name. In a world as wide as Runeterra, where tragedy is the weather and not the exception, what would it even mean to call one life the most ruined? The horror here is quiet, like a blade sliding back into its sheath after it has already done its work, leaving you to measure only the wound. If you try, you need a lantern to guide you. Loss of agency, duration of suffering, the distance between what they meant to do and the harm they unleashed, the faint flickering question of whether any kind of ending, redemption, oblivion, or simple rest, is still possible. Let the details move past you like drifting ash as you hold these measures in your hands, knowing they cut both the subject and the one who dares to weigh them. Consider Aatrox first, because his shadow falls over all the rest. Once a mural on a temple wall, a noble ascended carved in gold, he is now a howling will trapped in a prison of stolen bone and meat, hijacking mortal bodies just to feel the illusion of dying again. His agency is twisted, not lost. He can still choose, but every choice is framed by an existence he loathes. His suffering has no clock, no natural grave. There is no war he can win that will end him, only more wars to prolong the nightmare. Set him beside Callista, the spear of vengeance, and the air grows colder. She died once, horribly, betrayed by the king she bled for, and then bound into undeath by the very ruination she tried to prevent. Her agony is focused, double-edged, the first wound of treachery, the second of being weaponized as its echo. She remembers the moment of the blade going in. She remembers, and she cannot sleep. Then there is Viego, whose grief was so absolute it shattered an empire and drowned a continent in black mist. He did not mean to become a catastrophe, he only wanted his queen back. Yet the scale of his harm is oceanic. Every wraith in the Shadow Isles is, in some way, an extension of his refusal to let go. His tragedy is that love, ungoverned, became a spirit of ruin. And Lucian, who wins? He frees Senna from Thresh's lantern, cuts through the warden who turned love into a hostage, and stands at last with blade lowered. But his entire identity was forged against the bars of that prison. When the war is over, what remains is a man who has outlived his purpose, a hollow victory where the night wind asks, quietly, what he is now. So tell me, which horror is greater, to burn once in unimaginable pain, as Callista and Viego did, or to smoulder forever like Atrox, with no end in sight and no honest death to claim? You think you know this story, do you not? Because you have seen their power bars and win rates, but those are only masks. In Runeterra, tragedy is not a contest, but a landscape. Every champion is a hill or grave within it. And the point is not who wins at suffering, but what their stories reveal about the land and the spirit that shape them. Allow the night to grow a little deeper, and we will walk that landscape further to see what kind of world needs so many broken heroes just to keep existing at all. If you were them, the choice between peace and power. Allow the night to grow a little deeper. The land around you is crowded now, not with bodies, but with choices that never quite died, with blades that were swung once and are still falling in the dark. In a world as wide as Runeterra, horror is rarely a single scream. It is the slow realization that the distance between your life and theirs is thinner than you wish to believe. So step closer, just for a moment, and wear a different skin. You think you know this story, do you not? Atrox is a monster, a war god gone mad, a weapon that walks. Yet imagine you're what he once was, a revered ascended, a hero carved into temple walls until the war, the corruption, the imprisonment in steel. Now you wake only when you have stolen a mortal body, only when your wind is another man's breath. If the only way to feel an ending is to keep killing the world that trapped you, would you lay down the blade or keep fighting for an impossible death? Let the details move past you, like drifting ash. A ruined throne room, a body in poisoned water, a crown cracked. If you were Viego, a young king whose entire spirit calcified around one woman, would you accept her cooling hand and the finality of the grave, or tear the sea, the sky, the very borders of death to try again? The horror here is quiet, like a blade sliding back into its sheath after it has already done its work. It is the knowledge that love, when chained to power, can become a continent-drowning wound. Not all choices shatter the world at once. Some grind it down inch by inch. Walk beside Lucian in the long corridors of the black mist, lantern light always just ahead, his wife's soul caged a few cruel arm lengths away. Peace would mean surrendering her to oblivion, trusting that the spirit of the woman he loves is more than the fragments Thresh displays like trophies. Would you put down the guns and let the dead be dead, or would you hunt forever, until your own name is only another whispered curse in the night? And what of the quieter bargains, the ones that pretend to be pragmatic? Cain feels Rast coiled along his arm like a second shadow, promising victory, promising that war can be won if he stops flinching at the cost. Swain shares a throne with a demon that feeds on secrets, trading pieces of his own humanity for a noxus that survives. Are these acts of discipline, or the first unremarkable steps into damnation, the kind you would not even notice as your own? In a world as wide as this, the line between hero and horror is not a wall but a fogged mirror. These champions are not distant myths. They are distorted reflections of grief, of ambition, of the fear that your life will pass through the land and leave no mark at all. To understand them is not to excuse the graves they have filled, but to admit that, built in a world of endless war and listening spirits, you might reach for the same poisoned tools. The question that waits for you now is simple, and it will not stay patient for long. When we turn to the next tragedy, will you still be so sure which side of the mirror you stand on? The land remembers what the patch notes forget. So hold that mirror a moment longer. Let the question hang in the dark with you. Allow the night to grow a little deeper, because the next truth lives not in the brothers' hearts, but in the ground that keeps swallowing them and spitting them back out for your entertainment. In a world as wide as Runeterra, the client updates, the meta shifts, the numbers on a champion's blade rise and fall like a fever chart, yet the land does not read patch notes. Kale can be reworked from judge to juggernaut. Morgana's snare can lengthen or shrink by a fraction of a second, but in Damasia's soil, the scorch marks of their civil war between justice and mercy are permanent. Pantheon may trade lethality for bruiser durability, yet on Targon's slopes, Atreus still remembers what it felt like to have a god die screaming inside his ribs. This is the dissonance you stand inside every time you queue. On Summoner's Rift, death is a resource. It is a timer, a tactical window, a brief inconvenience before your spirit is flung back from a fountain in a burst of colour. But imagine the map as it truly would be, a field that remembers every match as a ghost of what really happened, each respawn a cruel parody of the one death that would not let go. Atrox does not go next. He hijacks another mortal body because he cannot bear existing without an ending. Karthus does not cheerfully sprint back to Lane. He is the memory of a man who decided that only undeath could make the horror of dying meaningful. You think you know this story, do you not? You hover over Thresh and see a support with a lantern and a hook. The horror here is quiet, like a blade sliding back into its sheath after it has already done its work. In universe, that lantern still holds Senna's soul. Every play you make with it is a pantomime of Lucian's centuries-long refusal to let his grief be ordinary. Callista's spectral charges, balanced and rebalanced for fairness, are echoes of a single betrayal on the Blessed Isles, where a niece was murdered by the king she tried to save and woke up as vengeance given shape. Let the details move past you like drifting ash, and then, just when you feel yourself relaxing into the rhythm of the game, interrupt that comfort. Ask what it means that Ionia's forests host champions who cannot heal from the first war they lost, no matter how many they win on your screen. The Shadow Isles do not care how often you pick Hecarim. His hooves still crush the same fleeing villagers beneath spectral armour. Targon does not forget Viego, whose love rotted into a ruination that drowned an entire civilization so he could claw at one corpse. Every time you lock in one of these tragic champions, you are not starting a fresh match. You are stepping into a story mid-scream, borrowing a body that never truly rests. Your quick decisions, your surrendered games, your remakes all skate over a lore that moves at the pace of centuries and refuses to reset. The next time the loading screen fades and the wind rises over the river, listen for the mismatch between your hunger to climb and the slow, crushing weight of the spirits beneath your cursor. That tension is where we must go next, because the final tragedies we have yet to touch are the ones that do not even remember they were human. Runeterra's Theology of Pain. What these stories say about the world allow the night to grow a little deeper. Let the details move past you like drifting ash, and look not at a single champion, but at the pattern burned into the land itself. In a world as wide as Runeterra, tragedy is not an interruption to the story. It is the price of admission. Again and again you see the same exchange. Power offered, suffering demanded. Etrox was once a radiant, ascended hero carved into Shuriman's stone. Now he hijacks mortal bodies, wears them like rotting armour, and swings his blade mostly to feel something close to an ending. Viego was a grieving king who loved one woman beyond reason. His devotion curdled into ruination, drowning an entire civilization in black mist, so he would not have to accept a single loss. Sometimes it comes as magic, sometimes as crown, sometimes as obsession, but the cost is always written in pain. Even where banners are bright and hymns are soft, the horror here is quiet. Demacia speaks of honour and justice, yet hunts its own mages into cages and exile, turning children into fugitives so that statues may remain uncracked. Ionia prays to balance while its wars and purges leave spirits howling, and every righteous resistance carves new scars into the soil. Targon sends chosen mortals up the mountain in search of celestial purpose, then hollow them into vessels, as Pantheon's shattered god and bleeding man both testify. The factions you are taught to call good still grind their faithful down like grain under a millstone. What makes these stories ache is not only the fall, but the refusal of an ending. Death does not close the book, it tears the page and pins you inside it. Callista dies betrayed and rises as the spear of vengeance condemned to reenact the moment of treachery forever. Thresh was once merely cruel. Undeath stretches his cruelty into an art form, each soul in his lantern a note in an endless scream. Hecarim, Carthus, the ruined legions that follow them, none are allowed to sink into silence. Even the void denies conclusion, unmaking identity so thoroughly that there is no one left to suffer, only the echo of what used to be a self. Against all this, the only mercy that feels clean is a pair of masked hunters moving through the tall grass. Lamb and wolf, kindred, are the one promise Runeterra never breaks, that every life ends. Yet even they are dodged, delayed, bargained with. Darkens steel bodies to postpone their visit. Viego tears open reality rather than accept their step. The entire cosmology bends itself into knots to avoid the one gentle blade that would truly finish a story. Why does that resonate with you sitting far from these wars and spirits? Because you recognize the shape, if not the scale. You live in systems that ask for loyalty, for labour, for belief, and often pay you back in exhaustion and quiet despair. You watch leaders preach virtue while their decisions leave unseen casualties. You know what it is to see suffering extended rather than healed, to watch endings withheld because someone, somewhere, profits from keeping the machine turning. Runeterra simply speaks the truth aloud. It makes the grinding visible. It turns the compromises and cruelties you half ignore into swords, crowns, and curses you cannot look away from. And as we move toward the last of these champions, those who barely remember their own names, you will see what happens when even the memory of being human is another thing the world is willing to spend. Your team of the damned, building the most tragic comp possible. So let us test that idea, here in the dark. If the world is willing to spend people like coin, then what happens when you gather 5 of its most overdrawn debts on a single rift? Allow the night to grow a little deeper and imagine not a ranked draft, but a seance disguised as champion select. You are not min-maxing damage now, you are arranging gravestones. The horror here is quiet, like a blade sliding back into its sheath after it has already done its work, and you are the one choosing which blades the land must remember. In a world as wide as Runeterra, no tragedy is truly alone. Every ruined king has a ruined court. Every fallen hero casts a longer shadow than his own. Consider one possible composition. Top lane, Artrox, once an ascended saviour, now a wandering prison of blood and metal, hijacking mortal bodies just to feel the edge of death and never quite reach it. Jungle, Callista, the spear of vengeance, murdered by the king she swore to protect. Her every gank a contract written in betrayal and iron. Mid, Viego, the ruined king, a man whose grief over a single poisoned queen drowned an entire civilization in black mist. Bot lane, you set Lucian and Senna together as if the game were merciful. You think you know this story, do you not? He hunts the warden who trapped her soul. She has already escaped that lantern, but not the war it created inside them. Their synergy on the map is obvious. Dashes, roots, relentless pursuit. Their synergy in the story is worse. A love so wounded that even reunion cannot unwind the years spent with a gun in one hand and a ghost in the other. Now imagine how their tragedies intersect. Atrox looks at Viego and sees another monarch who shattered the world rather than accept loss. Viego looks back and sees a weapon that outlived its war and learned only how to keep killing. Callista remembers serving a king who broke his oaths and finds, in this new king of ruin, a reflection of the same rot. Lucian and Senna walk among them like mortal witnesses, brothers in all but blood to every spirit that was promised rest and given torment instead. This is what it means to think about synergy in lore. Not only whose abilities chain, but whose wounds rhyme, whose choices scrape against each other like rusted mail. You are not just asking who wins lane, but whose presence makes everyone else's nightmare feel inevitable. Let the details move past you like drifting ash. Artrox's laughter when towers fall, Callista's oaths whispered over dragon pits, Viego's voice echoing in river fog, Lucian and Senna standing in base between rounds, as if at a shared grave. Then ask yourself, could you build something even heavier? In the comments, lay out your own team of the damned. Perhaps you pull in Thresh to stand beside Viego, or Pantheon to show what happens when a man survives his god, or Morgana and Kael to turn the bot lane into a civil war of sisters. Explain your logic. Tell the story of your draft as if you were arranging a tragedy on a stage, each role chosen not for victory, but for the way its spirit corrodes the others. Let this video become a kind of silent writer's room where you and strangers trace new constellations of suffering across the same familiar map. The most compelling, the most cursed of your designs, we may follow into their own deep nights in future episodes, walking each lane like a chapter. Because there is one more thing a composition like this can reveal, and it waits just beyond the next champion we call by name. Runeterra After Dark. How this series holds the lantern, and it waits just beyond the next champion we call by name. Allow the night to grow a little deeper. Feel how quiet it has become around you, how the wind has stopped trying to explain itself and simply moves, brushing past your ears like someone walking by in the dark. This is the first promise of Runeterra After Dark, to slow the world down until the stories you sprint past in highlight reels and patch notes have time to sit beside you, lay out their scars, and breathe. Most of the time you meet these champions in motion, Kaylee descending like a verdict, Viego flashing into a fight, his blade a smear of green regret. Atrox howling for another body to break. On the loading screen, their histories collapse into a title and a role. Here, we drag the timeline back open and linger in the parts that hurt and refuse to heal, the moments where a single choice tilts a life from protector to monster, from brother to executioner. In a world as wide as this land, you cannot hold every date, every name, every ruined kingdom in your hands at once, so each episode chooses a different lantern to carry. Sometimes it is tragedy, as when Atreus survives the death of a god inside his own ribs and walks away merely a man beneath a fallen pantheon. Sometimes it is horror, like Callista's murder by the king she swore to guard, her spirit pinned to undeath as the spear of vengeance. Sometimes it is love or betrayal, Lucian's crusade against the warden who keeps his wife's soul in a lantern, or Viego's grief so ravenous it drowns an entire civilization in black mist. Tonight, the lens was tragedy, but set inside an atmosphere closer to a ghost story than a war chronicle. The horror here is quiet, like a blade sliding back into its sheath after it has already done its work. You think you know this story, do you not? Champions, abilities, a ruined realm on the map. Yet, when you listen to Atrox beg for an end, he cannot reach, or imagine the countless spirits of the ruination pressed against the glass of Thresh's lantern, the familiar silhouettes start to look less like power fantasies and more like prisoners. Not every thread is meant to be catalogued. Let the details move past you, like drifting ash. The exact year Camivore fell, the full litany of names lost in the black mist, the number of times Demacia hunted its own mages in the name of order. What matters is the mood that remains when the client closes, a faint question that follows you into sleep, a sense that behind every broken champion on the balance sheet stands someone who was shattered first. We have walked through a graveyard tonight, though the markers wore splash art instead of stone. It is time to leave. Yet you do not go empty-handed. You carry a different way of looking. At the champions you lock in, at the war-scarred land beneath their feet, at the spirits that still remember what they were before the horror found them. In a moment, we will dim the lantern and step back from this mass of names to focus once more on a single waiting soul, and follow that one narrow path into the dark. Stepping back from the edge, a soft recap of the lives we touched. Allow the night to grow a little deeper as we step back from that single soul and look again at the procession that has passed before you. Let the details move past you like drifting ash, not to be catalogued, but to be felt. Fragments of blades, broken vows, the faint echo of a crown sinking beneath black water. You have walked beside Atrox, first among fallen ascended, a thing that once bore the weight of Shurima's honour, and now hijacks mortal bodies simply to experience, for one brief instant, the mercy of dying. You have watched Atreus, the man left standing in the crater where a god fell, discover that the Pantheon's death did not make him divine, only terribly, vulnerably human beneath an uncaring sky. You have seen Callista, the spear of vengeance, betrayed by the king she bled to protect, murdered once in a mortal hall, and then again in the ruination that twisted her oath into a curse. And far off, you have heard Viego, the ruined king, whisper Isolde's name as an entire civilization drowns for the crime of loving one woman more than the world. Around them move other figures you thought you knew. Lucian, whose blade and pistols are not style but sacrament, firing again and again at the warden who keeps Senna's soul imprisoned in a lantern that is less an artifact than a museum of preserved pain. Senna herself returned not as a simple miracle, but as a woman who has learned to live with the mist inside her lungs, her reunion with Lucian tender and jagged, a love story held together by shared nightmares. Thresh drifts at the edge of this procession, his hook idle, his grin patient. The horror here is quiet, like a blade sliding back into its sheath after it has already done its work. In the corner, Cain wrestles with Rast, his own body a battlefield where a Darkin whispers that surrender is strength, that identity is a small price for power. Around him, the mists of the Shadow Isles coil and recede, thick with the silhouettes of countless souls who never got a splash art, never earned a loading screen, but still scream in the wind. In a world as wide as Runeterra, every war leaves these shadows. Every grand narrative has a mass grave just off panel. What has tied them together for you is not only ruin, but pattern. Love turned lethal, like Viego's grief or Lucian's crusade. Duty that devours, as it did Callista, as it nearly did Atreus, as it once did Artrox when ascended honour became a cage. Identity eroded by power, whether that power is divine, Demacian, Noxian, or simply the intoxicating promise of never being weak again. A land and a spirit realm above it that writes suffering into its very laws, remembering each betrayal long after the betrayer is dust. You think you know this story, do you not? That league is only a bright arena of fast matches and colourful champions, where defeat is a lost nexus and nothing more. Yet now, when you hover over a portrait, you may feel the weight of the blade in that hand, the war behind those eyes, the night that never quite ends for them, even when your screen fades to victory. This is a great deal of darkness for a game that resets every 30 minutes, and that contrast is part of its pull. The spirits do not reset when you press play again. Soon you will return to the ordinary world, or to your next cue, fingers moving by habit while the client hums. But perhaps you will carry like a faint lantern glow at the edge of sight, the knowledge that the champions are not just builds and cooldowns, but walking consequences. Every duel has an echo, every grave has neighbours, and somewhere, just past the fog of your loading screen, more names are waiting to be spoken. What we do with other people's ghosts. So what do you do with all those names waiting past the fog? All those walking consequences crowding the edge of your minimap? You could mute them. You could rush past them. Or you could, just for a moment, let them haunt you a little, the way a half-remembered dream clings to you in the first grey minutes before morning. Allow the night to grow a little deeper. In a world as wide as Runeterra, this is one of the few places where you can practice grief at arm's length. You sit in your chair, fingers on keys, and you step into wars you will never bleed in, choices you will never be forced to make, blades you will never have to clean. The horror here is quiet, like a blade sliding back into its sheath after it has already done its work. And in that quiet, you are allowed to feel without being destroyed. Lucian's crosshairs line up on a lantern that holds his wife's soul. Atrox swings a borrowed arm and begs for an end he cannot reach. Callista answers a call for vengeance she did not choose. None of these champions are real, and yet the feelings they crystallize, grief that will not scab, regret that circles the same moment forever, the thin, desperate hope of redemption, are taken from lives very much like your own. Let the details move past you like drifting ash, and you begin to recognize shapes you know. You think you know this story, do you not? That it is about distant kings and ruined isles and spirits with names you will never meet in your notifications. But when Viego tears a continent apart because he cannot put his love down, when Atreus stands beneath a sky of gods knowing he is only a man, the distance shrinks. The client window is small, yet inside it you are rehearsing how to sit with someone else's ruin without looking away. That is the strange mercy of these ghosts. They ask nothing of you except attention, no reply, no advice, only that you listen long enough to remember that behind every username, behind every first-time Kane or exhausted Pantheon support, there may be a person carrying their own invisible ruination, their own unspoken spear in the back. Every duel has an echo. Every surrender vote has a history you do not see. So when you stay to hear these stories, you are doing something quietly rebellious. The world urges you to scroll, to queue, to forget, to let pain be background noise. Instead, tonight, you stopped. You let the spirits of a fictional land speak, and in that pause you practiced a kind of empathy that might follow you out of the client and into the next tired cashier, the next silent friend in voice chat, the next stranger who pings and never types why. And if this is what happens when you sit with one set of ghosts, what else waits in the dark? There are other lands, other wars, other haunted corners where the horror is quiet but the wounds are not. And if you are willing, we can go there next. Your turn to haunt the comments. Choosing the next tragic spotlight. So let us not leave this darkness empty. If the last ghosts have followed you out of the client and into your own quiet rooms, then for a moment allow the night to grow a little deeper and listen to the wind between these names. In a world as wide as Runeterra, there are more ruined souls than we could ever carry alone. You must choose which one we walk beside next. You stand now at a crossroads of tragedies. On one path, Atrox, once a radiant ascended hero carved into temple walls, now a howling blade that hijacks mortal bodies just to feel himself die, again and again, until even victory tastes like ash. On another, Viego, a king whose love curdled into ruin so vast it drowned a civilization, each tear he refused to shed becoming another soul bound to the black mist. Or perhaps you feel the pull of Callista, the betrayed oath made flesh, murdered by the king she swore to protect, and returned as a spear that never stops seeking treachery. You think you know this story, do you not? Names you have clicked 100 times in Champion Select, lines you have half heard while rushing to lane, yet what matters now is not only whom you name, but why. Tell me what unsettles you most about Atrox's endless war. Is it the way his laughter sounds like someone begging for an ending? Or the way his victories are just more cages? Tell me which moment in Viego's ruinous love makes your skin crawl? The first drop of black water on Camavor's marble floors, or the last time he whispers Isolde's name into an empty crown. Do not be afraid to look sideways. Perhaps the tragedy that haunts you is Callista's, not in her spears, but in the instant she understands that loyalty is the blade that will kill her. Perhaps you see horror in a champion the game plays for levity, a yordle whose cheer rings a little too loudly over a battlefield, or in a minor spirit who watched the ruination roll across their island and could do nothing but remember. The horror here is quiet, like a blade sliding back into its sheath after it has already done its work. Here is the pattern interrupt. You are not only a listener, you are a witness called to testify. In the comments, write as if you are leaving offerings at a shrine. Name the champion or the forgotten soul you want to follow, and then lay out the reason like incense, the line of law that broke you, the cinematic frame you cannot forget, the single choice that turned a protector into a monster. Let the details move past you like drifting ash and settle into words. I will walk those corridors with you. I will read what you leave behind, one entry after another, a communal ritual of sorting the dead, deciding which ghost speaks next. If you wish to keep tracing these wounds through other lands, to hear how other brothers, other lovers, other soldiers were unmade, then remain with us. Let your like be a lantern on the path, your subscription a quiet promise to return when the next story rises from the dark. Leaving the rift at midnight, a final walk past the graves. So let us stand up from the ledger, you and I, and step back out into the dark. Allow the night to grow a little deeper around the edges of the screen, as if the last page of this story has turned not in a book, but across the rift itself, where minions have long since stopped marching, and only the wind still remembers the lanes. The wards you placed are dying. One by one, their pale eyes gutter and blink out, leaving only faint after-images burned into the mist, like regrets you tried to illuminate too late. The fog that once clung thick to river and brush begins to thin, not because anything is safer now, but because the spirits have retreated to their hiding places, sated for the moment by another night of borrowed bodies and repeated deaths. The horror here is quiet, like a blade sliding back into its sheath after it has already done its work. You walk the river with your cursor, tracing that slow silver path where scuttle crabs sleep beneath the surface. You know now that this is not just terrain. This is the black mirror where Callista might rise, a spear first, then a shape, then a memory of betrayal given form. Every splash, every ripple feels like the shudder of some drowned oath trying to claw its way back into the war. In a world as wide as Runeterra, not every ghost needs a grave. Some only need a place where the water runs deep and the promises ran deeper. The jungle, once a maze of timers and camps in your mind, has changed as well. Brush that you warded without thinking now looks like the torn edge of a nightmare, each frond a finger beckoning you off the path. Somewhere between red and raptors, you can almost hear the scrape of something wooden dragging across stone, the patient creak of fiddlesticks waiting with that ruined scythe, more scarecrow than spirit, more absence than presence. Let the details move past you like drifting ash, a crow's wing, a dangling lantern, a whisper that sounds too much like your own voice answering from the dark. You pass the lane where Atrox might have fallen under tower fire, only to rise again in another borrowed body, laughing without joy at the futility of your victory. A cracked sword lies there in your imagination, half buried in the dirt, as if the land itself is trying to smother it and cannot. You think you know this story, do you not? Hero, villain, pentakill, defeat, screen. Yet, behind that familiar rhythm stands an old ascended thing that has forgotten how to live and can only rehearse dying. Back at the platform, the Nexus is whole again, humming softly, crystalline and indifferent. Your champion portrait has slid back into its place among hundreds of others, another tragic face in a mosaic of war and longing. You sit above it all, hand on the mouse, your cursor hovering over the play again button like a hesitant spirit over its own body. The match is over. The map is reset. But the champions are not waiting for you like loyal soldiers on a rack. They are resting uneasily in the spaces between matches, each caught in the loop we have traced tonight. Callista in the moment of her murder, Lucian in the instant before the lantern closes, Viego forever reaching for a queen who will not turn back. They do not sleep. They replay. They are pinned to their own unfinished choices, like insects in a glass case, until your cue pops and the stage lights flare and the whole tragedy is dragged into motion once more. So, linger a moment longer before you click. Let the rift stay empty, its stone paths silvered by moonlight, its brush stirring in a wind that carries no footsteps. somewhere near Barren Pit, where you have fought and died and triumphed and surrendered. Imagine a bell hung from an unseen arch. Hear it toll once, softly, not for victory and not for defeat, but for the passing of another night spent listening to ghosts. Then let the sound fade. Leave the graves as they are. The land will remember for you. Credits that never roll. The names that don't get to leave, but credits do not roll here. The bell falls silent. The graves lie still, and yet the game does not truly end, because in this place there is no final black screen, no list of names gliding upward into a forgiving dark. The horror here is quiet, like a blade sliding back into its sheath after it has already done its work, and you are left staring at a battlefield that pretends to reset every 30 minutes. If League ever offered you a credits screen, whose name would stay with you when the lights came up and the client closed? You think you know this story, do you not? That these are only champions, only designs and numbers and balance changes, yet in a world as wide as Runeterra, every portrait on the loading screen is also a memorial plaque for someone who never got to walk away. Let the details move past you like drifting ash. The splash art, the voice lines, the title cards, all the tiny epitaphs you scroll through without really seeing. Aatrox would be there, first among the unending, once a radiant ascended hero carved into Shuriman's stone, now a howling parasite of steel that hijacks mortal bodies just to feel himself die again. Callista follows, the spear of vengeance, murdered by the king she swore to shield, pinned between loyalty and betrayal, until even her spirit could only move by nailing others to their own broken oaths. Viego's name would smear across the screen like spilled ink, a ruined king whose grief was so vast it drowned a civilization and turned love into a continent-wide plague. Then, in smaller letters, the ones who tried to resist the tide. Lucian and Senna, two lovers who should have grown old in the sunlight, now waging an endless night war against the warden who keeps her soul in a lantern that never swings far from their sight. Atreus, the man beneath the fallen pantheon, who felt a god die inside his ribs and still walks back onto the rift with nothing but human bone and human will. Cain, whose every level and item is also a negotiation with the thing in his scythe. A slow argument over which of them will own the body you see sprinting down the river. Some of these champions did not lose the game. They lost their souls long before you ever locked them in, long before rune pages and skins and metas, and what you pilot now is only what the land could not bury. Their horror is not static. It breathes in lore updates, in events, in the quiet revisions of a single new voice line. It flickers in fan art, in theories, in the way a player hovers over a portrait a second longer than they meant to. Allow the night to grow a little deeper, and you can feel it. Tragedy here is not a frozen tableau, but a living script that keeps being rewritten in blood and memory. So when you do finally log off, when your own screen does go dark, carry one name with you as a private epilogue. Perhaps it is Aatrox begging for an end that never comes. Perhaps it is Senna half freed and half imprisoned. Perhaps it is some other face we have not had time to trace. Ask yourself, the next time you see them in Champion Select, what it means to click on a life that cannot leave. Because there is one more name, one more story, waiting in the shadows of that list, and it has been watching you far longer than you have watched it. Extinguishing the lantern, a gentle farewell and final XTA, or an end that never comes. Perhaps it is Senna, half freed and half imprisoned. Perhaps it is some other face we have not had the time to trace. Ask yourself the next time you see them in Champion Select, what it means to click on a life that cannot leave, because there is one more name, one more story waiting in the shadows of that list, and it has been watching you far longer than you have watched it. So let us come back to the lantern, not as a weapon now, not as a prison, but as a single wavering light in this long corridor of night. You have chosen to walk with me. Thresh's glass eye hangs between us, green and unblinking, and for a moment you can almost make out every spirit we have spoken of tonight reflected in that curve. In a world as wide as Runeterra, every tragedy seems to find its way into that glow. Allow the night to grow a little deeper. Imagine a hand, perhaps Lucian's, perhaps your own, reaching out not to shatter the lantern but to cover it. Fingers closing over the glass, the light dimming to a tired ember until even that small defiance of the dark finally surrenders. Or, if you prefer the arrow to the flame, picture Kindred's bow drawn at last, the string no longer held in restraint, the shot loosed into the sky as a gentle final punctuation to this vigil. You have stayed here a long time. You have sat with blades that never rust, with brothers who never reconcile, with heroes like Atrox and Callista and Pantheon, who learned that war does not end when the body falls. The horror here is quiet, like a blade sliding back into its sheath after it has already done its work. Thank you for remaining in that quiet, for listening to a story heavier than a highlight reel, for letting these spirits stand beside you without turning away. Now I will ask something of you before we part. Let the details move past you like drifting ash, then choose one ember to hold. Tell me in the comments below which champion feels to you like the most tragic of them all, and if you were forced to march into battle with a full team of the condemned, which 5 would you bind together on the same doomed rift? Then look ahead. Who among them deserves an entire Runeterra after dark of their own? Is it Thresh and his lantern, Viego and his drowned kingdom, Kindred and the last breath of every soldier? You think you know this story, do you not? Tell me whose version you wish to hear in full. And when you close this tab, it is all right to step back into the brighter part of the game. Lock in your playful skins, mute the music of the dead. Laugh in Champion Select if you can. The ghosts will not be offended. They are patient. They will wait in the corners of Howling Abyss, in the ruined towers of the Shadow Isles, in the quiet line between Lucian's gunfire and Senna's light, until you are ready to remember them again. Listen, before we go. The wind is moving through Ionian bamboo somewhere far from here, each hollow stalk answering the next. There is the faintest echo of twin pistols discharging, then reloading, then falling silent, and beneath it all the soft, inevitable footsteps of Kindred drawing close, then passing by, then fading, until there is nothing left but night.